Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. This happened last fall. I live far out in the country woods on my family's large property. So the house we live in is literally surrounded with woods, making nighttime very dark whenever there's no moon out. Even as a child, I felt fear at night around our woods, but only at night. I was fine exploring all day in the sun. With that said, that could just be easily written off as a normal childhood fear, but even into my adulthood, it was a feeling I never got over. I still hate to be around our woods at night, because of the feeling it gives me. Last fall, I was outside one night on our front porch. With the porch light on overhead, I could see at least pretty good around the bottom of the porch area into some of the front yard. As I stood on the porch in front of the door, that's also where the porch steps are, I started to get this feeling that something was watching me, that I couldn't see. Side note, I actually get that feeling pretty often, as though I'm never really alone outside. I tried to ignore that feeling since I'm used to getting it while outside at night alone, but this night, I just couldn't shake that feeling off. I realized whatever I felt watching me had come from our backyard and was walking through the side yard at the far end of the porch where it's in total darkness. I could feel whatever it was turning to the front yard and then creeping closer to the front porch steps. There's big tall bushes that are in front of our porch, so you can't really see through them at whatever may be on the other side, unless it's daylight. But by this time, I was really getting scared because I know I could feel something getting closer to me. I just couldn't see it. I was trying to hurry up and finish my cigarette while I was staring into the bushes near the end of the porch steps, like I said. It could be seen from the porch light, but that's when I noticed one of the branches that stuck out from the last bush near the porch steps had moved, as if someone or something had just walked by it or bumped into it. The way it moved was as if someone grazed it while walking by, and I remember thinking how there was no wind blowing at all, and nothing made sense to make only that one branch move the way it did. No other part of the bush had moved. Right after I saw the branch move, though, I had this loud voice in my head screaming, "Run, run, run, get inside now!" I could feel whatever it was starting to walk up our porch steps when I threw my cigarette away and ran inside, locked the door, which unfortunately at that time was hard to lock without my husband's help. The door was swollen or something at that time, making it tricky to lock. So as I frantically tried to lock the front door, logic kicked in, asking me exactly what do I think locking a door is seriously going to do to keep out whatever is outside that I can't see. That thought scared me as well. But I did feel a little bit safer inside. I hoped whatever was outside was not going to come in. Still unnerved, I was shutting off lights in the house to get ready for bed since my husband and kids were already asleep. As I was walking through the living room, I felt that evil presence again, and I looked up and noticed the living room curtains slightly open. They also viewed out onto the front porch beside the front door. I could just feel this tall figure standing right outside that window, staring at me. I freaked out and just ran to bed, and as I crawled into bed, wishing my husband was still up, he got up to go to the bathroom, and I blurted out to him that something had just chased me inside. I said I couldn't get the door locked, and asked if he could go lock it for me. My husband got up, still half asleep, but knew that I was clearly scared by whatever was outside, and he went to the living room door to lock it. He came back to bed and told me that as he was walking up to the door to lock it, he got this weird feeling that something was staring at him through the exact same window in the exact same way that I had felt. I told him how freaky that was that he said that, because I had left that part out when I told him what had happened to me outside. So for him to feel someone standing on the porch staring through that window too made me realize that it couldn't be all my imagination. This isn't something that constantly happens outside, as to this day I still go outside to smoke alone at night. I'm just confused as to why that different night was so weird. I've never experienced anything like that, and I know my family's property before they built on it. It was nothing but woods, so I'm at a loss as what it could have been. As I mentioned, I've always been afraid of our woods at night, and have had other experiences outside, but nothing as scary as that night. I don't really believe what I experienced in the woods is the same thing that was the thing that was on our porch, but I wonder where it went after leaving that night, as well as why it didn't come inside. I highly doubt locking a door will keep spirits or whatever from coming in. After hearing and reading a lot of other people's experiences, it's made me wonder if the possibility of whatever it was maybe a guardian of some sorts, like perhaps my dad, who I've felt around me since I was little. He passed away before I was born. Maybe he watches over me and keeps me safe, but all I know is, whatever it was that night, it didn't feel nice or friendly in any way, and sent fear through me. But yet once I was inside, it seemed as though it was unable to make entry, as it just stood on the porch, watching me through the living room window. Not sure if this is related, and it's probably not, but I kept getting this very odd little scratch on the back of my hand near the bottom side of my thumb. It honestly looked as though a tiny kitten had scratched me right there, and no, I don't own any kittens or cats. Whenever I would notice I had the scratches, I would feel this burning sensation where it would appear, just like something had burned me. The last one appeared about 5 in the morning while I was waiting in our car for my youngest son's school bus to arrive. I was sitting in the dark of our car, as the sun still hadn't risen yet, when I started to feel something burn in my thumb area. I turned on the overhead light, and slowly started to see that this tiny little kitten-looking scratch appeared in the exact same spot it did the previous month. I thought it was too random to have the exact same looking scratch I had the previous month. I just accepted it as one of those scratches you don't realize you get from whatever actually scratched you. But the fact that it was in the exact same spot troubled me. I could even see where it had left a little bit of scarring from the first one, as the new one was on top of it. I was going to wait to see if it happened a third time, but it never happened after that, so I'm kind of at a loss as to exactly why it happened. But I thought it odd that it was at the exact same time I experienced whatever came up onto our porch that one night. Hey, if anybody's got anything to add to this or to share with me, I'd love to hear about it. As far as asking if I was going through a bad or a hard time at that time, I'd say nothing out of the normal. If any recent year was a hard one, I'd say the previous year was the worst for me, as I had just lost my mom. Thank you in advance to any helpful suggestions as to what I may have experienced that night. Insane College Roommate, submitted by Jackie. Here's the obligatory, my real name isn't Jackie, but it is for this story. When I went to college in 1996, I was assigned a roommate that I did not meet at orientation. They did give us each other's phone numbers, and we talked over the summer about who had what worked out for the room, but that was all about the interaction I had with her. I'll call her Jenny. I had a microwave, she had a TV, and we figured we'd be pretty well set, and we were excited to meet each other and start our freshman year. Everything was fine for the first few weeks, but then I started to notice the strange habits she had. She would ask to borrow clothes, which normally I wouldn't care about. By this time, we knew each other a little bit, but I started to notice that she was borrowing things that she should not have been borrowing, like my bra and panties. I mean, a sweater is one thing, but your underwear is really creepy. Not wanting to create a whole thing out of it, I just told her that I wasn't cool with her doing that, and if she would please stop. I didn't care if she raided my closet for anything else. She apologized, and we moved on. Not long after that, though, I was up late studying at my desk with my desk light on and my headphones on, doing my best to not disturb her as she had gone to bed earlier. When I got up to get a water out of our mini fridge, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, just staring at me. I had no idea how long she had been doing that, but it was freaking me out, and I asked her if she was okay. She said, "Yeah, I'm fine." And I asked her, "Can't you sleep?" And she said, "No, I was just looking around the room." What the fuck? I didn't say anything else and said, "Well, I'm going to go to sleep now." I went and brushed my teeth and then got into bed. The next night was Friday night, and a bunch of the other girls on our floor of the dorm we were living in were going to a house party. You know, the red Solo cup for $3 and all the bad beer you can drink. I wasn't dating anyone and had no interest at that point in time, so I wasn't really showing myself off to any of the guys there, but was still mingling and chatting with everyone. Jenny most certainly was looking for a guy, and she ended up hooking up with one of the guys who was an upperclassman that lived in the house hosting the party. I left the party with my floor mates and went home to crash as I was more than a little tipsy. But about 5 in the morning, my dorm room door opened, and Jenny came stumbling in with a huge smile on her face, and not wearing any shoes. It was so early, I didn't say anything, but she came right over to me and said that she had had a great night and held up a baggie. I had kind of mumbled to her, "What the heck is that?" And she just gave me that huge smile and said, "I blew Tony," and held up the bag. She had spit his stuff into the baggie and brought it home with her. I was beyond horrified and simply said, "Oh," and rolled over and went back to sleep. She passed out on her bed. I couldn't really sleep, so I got up to go for a run to cleanse the beer I had put down at the party. I did a loop around campus, showered, and then met my friends in the hallway to go to breakfast. I thought about telling them all the weird stuff Jenny was doing, but didn't. Maybe she had some mental problems or something. We all decided to go watch a soccer game that afternoon after lunch, and we went back to my friend Melissa's room to watch The Real World and just hang out. About an hour later, there was a banging on the door, and Mel opened it to a disheveled Jenny who yelled, "Why didn't you wake me up for breakfast?" The rest of us just stood there in shock. Another girl, Kat, said, "Jenny, your feet are bleeding." I looked down and saw that, yeah, her feet were bloody, and was about to say I'd take her to the campus infirmary when she just screamed, "They were bleeding! It's stopped now!" Then she just left and went back to her room. It was then that I decided to tell my friends what was going on and all the strange things she was doing. They told me to stay with them if I wanted to or needed to, and if anything else happened or I felt threatened, I should go to our RA. I didn't go back to my room for a while. We just went to the game and then went to dinner together. When I did go back to my room, Jenny was not there, but the windows were open, and it was mid-October in Rhode Island, so you can imagine it was just a little chilly. I shut the windows, sat down to do some homework before I went to a movie the campus was showing. I got back to our room around 11:30, and there was a note on our whiteboard that just said, "Dearest Jackie, please keep the windows open just a bit. Love you, Jenny." At first I didn't think anything of it and went inside, but after a few minutes I cringed. "Love you? Okay." I grabbed my comforter and pillow and went down the hall to Melissa's and asked if I could crash there that night. She and her roommate Chris said sure, and Chris brought out a bottle of Rumpelmans, and we all had a couple of drinks just talking and watching TV. We fell asleep, but at around 3 in the morning there was a thumping on the door. Not a pounding, just a constant thumping. It kept going for more than 5 minutes, but when we snuck over to the door and looked out the peephole, there was no one there. We could see a shape under the crack of the door, but agreed we were not opening it. The phone rang, and it was the girl from across the hall. She said Jenny was sitting against the door, banging the back of her head against it. Mel hung up and called the desk downstairs and asked what RA was on duty and to come up there. She had heard and seen enough of Jenny. The RA on duty came up, and then the shrill laughter of Jenny. There was another voice, and then a scuffle broke out. We heard Erica the RA say, "Call campus police," and the scuffle kept up with Jenny yelling out gibberish. After a few minutes, campus police showed up, and with another struggle, they took her away. Erica knocked on the door, and she came in. We told her all the crazy things that Jenny had been doing. She told me to file an official report, and I asked if I could switch roommates. She said she'd look into it, and then spotted the rumplements. We were a dry dorm. Ladies, lose it or do a better job of hiding it. That's all she said and left. It was a funny line we all needed. The next morning, I went to get my running stuff from my room, and again, the windows were wide open. There were bloody footprints on the floor that I made sure to walk around, and then I saw these baggies tacked onto Jenny's corkboard above her desk. There were 5 in all, with what I later found out to be semen, with letters written on them in Sharpie. It took me a minute, but each of the letters corresponded with the first names of the guys who were living in the house that had the party on Friday night. I gagged a little and immediately called the RA again. She came up, took one look at the floor, and called the RD. They both told me to get anything I needed out of the room, and Melissa came down to help me get my books and shower stuff and some clothes. I still went for a run, and when I got back, the RD was still at my room, but now with campus police and the local authorities. The RD was this wonderful woman named Karen who always called everyone honey, and she pulled me aside and said, "Honey, did you make a report about what Erica told me?" I said not yet, and she said, "Well, get showered up, honey, and then come down to my office." I did, and there I filled out a report and then answered questions from the police about Jenny. I asked about getting another roommate, and they said that that wasn't going to be an issue. Jenny wasn't coming back to campus for a while, if ever, but they wouldn't tell me why. When I called my parents and told them, they said to get permission to come home for a couple of days, and I did with my profs on Monday. My RD had also made some calls to them explaining the situation. My parents picked me up, and I went home for a bit. When I got back to campus on that Thursday, the RD met me and my parents and told me that my room had been completely emptied, professionally cleaned and sanitized, and that I would have a single for the rest of the year. Jenny was gone. Jenny had been taking a boatload of acid and ecstasy and was pretty far gone almost all of the time. When they got her outside of Melissa's door, she had an entire blotter of acid on her, and she had also been selling it. I never heard from her again, and all I have are these stories. Sometimes I wonder where she is and if she's okay now. Who knows? When I was a kid growing up in the late 90s, one of my best friends lived in a rural part of town. We met because he went to the same school, but he lived miles away from my more suburban neighborhood. We're still friends to this day, and we still talk about what happened on this night. We decided to have a campout in the woods behind his house. His family didn't have a ton of land, but they had a pretty decent patch. And honestly, I have no idea who owned the land behind him. But for whatever reason, there was this old greenhouse about a quarter of a mile behind where his property ended, and it became the woods. It was just this old wooden building with windows and a fireplace. And I guess maybe somebody probably did live there at some point in time, but no one used it anymore, and we kind of turned it into our own little fort. We were 15 at the time and decided to spend the night out in our fort and have a fire and just do what kids do. We snuck a couple of 2 liters of wine coolers from his parents' fridge and thought we were being total badasses. Lol. It was a Saturday night in July when we did this. We went out to the fort in all seasons, but we never thought about staying out there until the summer. His parents and my parents were cool with it, so we made our way back there after we had dinner with his family. I brought my ghetto blaster, and we were just going to play music and hang out. We got a campfire going, and all was well with the music of the day playing on my ghetto, probably some rap stuff that we were into back then. We were laughing and talking about a job that we wanted to get when we were 16, but we were also talking about the 2 girls we were dating at the time. This is going to sound cheesy, but there was a game that we played called MASH. You wrote the letters M-A-S-H on the top of a piece of paper, and then you had 5 different lines on one side of the paper, 5 different lines on the other side of the paper, and then 5 lines at the bottom. The first set on the left were supposed to be filled with the names of girls you thought were hot. The other set of lines on the right side were supposed to be jobs you would like to have in your future. And then finally, the 5 spaces at the bottom of the page were supposed to be just random numbers that would equal how many kids you would have. At the top of the page, the M stood for mansion, the A stood for apartment, the S stood for shack, and the H stood for house. You had to pick a random number, and the person you were playing with would use that number to go through all of the lines in the letters and cross them out systematically. Gosh, I hope this is making sense. Anyway, at the end of the game, you would end up with one of the letters, one of the girls you thought was the hottest, the job you really wanted, and the number of kids you would have. Part of the fun was we always made sure that some of the answers had to be outlandish. For example, 67,000 kids, or some crazy woman that you would never have any business being with. My friend, whom I'll call Eric for this story, started off the game and picked a bunch of funny things, and we were laughing before we even got the silly game going. He ended up with Sharon Stone as his wife, and they would live in a shack with 7 kids, and he would be a school teacher. We were dying of laughter. Right about that time, though, we heard a noise from the woods behind the fort. As I said, his place was very rural, and outside of the quarter to a half mile into the woods where this place was from his house, it was another 6 or 7 miles to the next road where people lived. It was rare for anybody to see anyone out there, save for a pond where some people once in a while would go fishing. The fishing there sucked. I don't think it was stocked, so like I said, it was rare. What we heard, though, was the sound of footsteps walking through the forest, the cracking of branches and the crushing of leaves. At first we thought, maybe it's his older brother coming out to scare us, or maybe even just wanting to hang out. But when we called out and said, "Hey, who's there?" no one answered, and the footsteps stopped. I said, "Hey, I think this is weird," and Eric said, "Hey, just chill out," and he gave me another plastic cup full of Bartles and James wine cooler. Yeah, okay, wine coolers, don't make fun of us. We sat listening for a while, and everything was still quiet, so we turned the music back on, and then decided to play another game of MASH. For whatever reason, I also decided to have Sharon Stone as one of the girls on my list. After the random number elimination, she ended up also being my wife. We were dying of laughter again. When I look back, I remember that Sharon Stone was like one of the hottest women in entertainment, so it was kind of obvious that we would pick her and put her onto the list. When the fire started to die down, we decided to go inside the fort and go to sleep. A while before this, we had dragged an industrial carpet out to the fort, so we just threw our sleeping bags on top of that and were going to talk ourselves to sleep listening to music. About an hour after we went into the fort, we started to hear the footsteps outside again, and no doubt about it, they were coming towards the fort. I whispered to Eric, "Hey, there really is somebody out there." And he responded, "Yeah, man, I know." We talked about making a run for it, but we didn't know who it was, or maybe it was just a deer, and maybe we were just being little girls. But after a few minutes, we heard the sounds of those footsteps right outside the fort, and suddenly, the entire building started to shake as if there was an army of guys outside. Whoever it was just shaking the hell out of it. Then we heard this crazy laughter, and I won't lie, I scooched over closer to Eric in my sleeping bag because I was scared. He was too. You know, even when you're 15 and you think you have the world by the ass, when something really scary happens, you don't always act like a tough guy. The shaking finally stopped after like 5 minutes, and we yelled out, "Hey, leave us alone. Get out of here. We'll just go if you want us to leave." We heard the footsteps slowly retreat back into the woods, and we just laid there for another hour or so, scared stiff and not knowing what to do. Finally, I crawled out of my sleeping bag and went to the fort door, pushed it open, and saw that the fire was starting to kick up a little bit again, but it was mostly just embers. We were leaving it that way so we could make breakfast in the morning. But what terrified me was what I saw on a tree right next to where we were having our fire. Impaled into the tree with an old rusty trowel was a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper was written in a very childish scrawl, "You both can't be married to Sharon Stone." I went back into the fort to see Eric getting out of his sleeping bag and told him we needed to get out of there. And we did. We put out the fire and then ran back to his house and slept on the back porch. In the morning, his father came out and said, "Hey, what happened to sleeping at the fort?" We told him what happened, and yeah, he saw the old garden trowel or whatever stabbed into the tree and what was written on that note. I have no idea who was out there that night or who decided to listen into our entire conversation and then leave that threatening piece of paper that, quite frankly, looked like it had been written in blood, as if someone had pricked their finger and then wrote it on the piece of paper. I never went back to that fort, and neither did Eric. If I recall correctly, his parents forbade anybody from going back there. Anyway, that happened a long time ago, but I still replay it in my head like it was yesterday. First off, I'm really sensitive to energy and whatnot. And everywhere I go and every person I'm with, my senses are on high alert. It has caused serious anxiety since I was very young. I can walk into a building and immediately feel a certain vibe, whether it be light, heavy, sad, happy, alone, or not alone. One time, I invited my close friend Lana over to my house after feeling the need to see her. When she got there, I noticed she seemed a bit off, but I ignored it and continued with the usual "let's catch up" conversation. After a little while, I brought up a small experience I had recently. I often experience an overwhelming presence, and sometimes I'll share it with her if I need to talk about it. I noticed when the topic of ghosts came up, she seemed to perk up a bit, not in a good way. After I finished talking, she said, "Actually, it's kind of weird you're mentioning that type of stuff. Something really bad happened a couple of weeks ago, and I haven't told you about it yet." Side note, a few days before I made plans to see her, I had a really unsettling nightmare, and I saw an image of a childlike female in a dress standing before me in a hallway. She was unable to speak and only stood there staring at me. That was all I could remember from the dream, and I forgot about it afterwards. This could or could not have some meaning behind it, but I thought it's worth mentioning. Lana has a cousin, Abigail, whom we both spend time with, and most of the time when I see them, I just go over to Abby's house. I've mentioned to Lana before, a long time ago, how I feel about her house. It's a heavy, dark, unsettling atmosphere that doesn't fail to put me on edge every single time I go there. She's agreed with me before that she feels a bit uneasy there too, and that's all we ever said about it before this incident, and we never mentioned how we felt to Abby. You kind of ignore those feelings after a while. Abigail's grandparents both passed away, and she missed them a lot. She decided she wanted to make a Ouija board and see if it was possible to get in contact with them. If I had been there to put a stop to it, believe me, I would have. After a while of tinkering with and perfecting their homemade Ouija board, they started off. It took some time before they were able to get a response, but they did. They got in contact with her grandpa, and Abby was as ecstatic as you can imagine. I mean, overjoyed, fulfilled. Until the communication completely cut off, and something else took over. without their control, and without any warning. They started asking questions. It said it was a bad spirit, whatever that was supposed to mean. It said it was 9 years old, a female that had died in a car accident. At this point in Lana's story, I dropped my jaw and immediately remembered my dream. I felt sick. After a few more questions, they wanted to say goodbye, considering this was not who they wanted to talk to. However, the spirit said no. They said goodbye again. No. A third time. No. It went to no every time they asked to say goodbye. Now feeling quite panicky, they calmed themselves down and kept talking, asking some distraction questions like favorite color, where they were born, etc. They felt ready to say goodbye again, but the planchette flew across the board to no, really fast and in an unbelievably aggressive manner. They were terrified. They ripped up their homemade board and threw it on the bed. They left the house for a couple of hours, got some food, and took their minds off of things. When they returned, there was the Ouija board sitting on the bed, placed back together like a puzzle, mocking them, of course. I completely disregarded this and said that they had to be lying. But the whole time, my friend was sitting there, shaking, almost in tears as she was telling me this. I could feel the fear radiating from her, and I've been friends with her for more than 10 years. She's not a jokester, and I've never seen her so scared. She said she didn't tell me right away because she didn't even talk to her cousin about it right after it happened. They were trying to act like it never really did happen. It was something so mind-boggling and mentally traumatizing, they couldn't believe it actually occurred. Lana said that since then, Abby is seeing, hearing, and feeling things, and I think her absolute fear is only giving off more energy to make this entity more powerful. I don't think this 9-year-old girl is the ultimate spirit truly at play. I think there is something darker controlling everything. Hence why the girl in my dream didn't say or do anything. Also, it makes sense that if it was something more intense, it would use this other spirit to seem more friendly or less intimidating. Please, if you ever feel the urge or desire to try using a Ouija board, just don't. It's not worth it. Last year, 2018, was a very busy year for me, meaning that I had little to no time to meet any girls. Due to my busy schedule, I decided to make a Tinder account. I've never had any experience with such app or online dating, and I didn't actually plan on meeting up with a random girl to go on a blind date or anything. I just wanted to see what the fuss was about, and if that shit actually worked. So, the app still being something new to me, I matched with this really pretty girl. She seemed short, light-skinned, and had a nice smile. Her account wasn't a catfish or any sort of fake profile. It seemed genuine and legit. Anyway, I know that I didn't actually want to hit it off with any girl in this manner, but she was very hot, and I said, fuck it. So I slid into her DMs with a simple, hey. A couple of hours went by, and we got each other's Snapchat users and phone numbers. We exchanged Snapchat photos, so with that said, there's no way that her Tinder account was a fake. I felt better knowing that for some reason. She said that she lived in a city that was about 25 or 30 miles north of mine. I had nothing planned for the next day, and neither did she, so we decided to meet up at her house to mess around. The next day came, and we planned to meet up around 10:30 that night. The neighboring city where she was from was a 30 to 45-minute drive from my place, so around 10ish I decided to start driving over. As I was driving over, I got a phone call from her telling me to go over at a later time, around midnight. I didn't mind, and since I had friends who lived in her city, I paid them a visit while I waited for her. 11:45 rolled around, and I started to drive to her place. My friends didn't know what I was up to. They just thought I popped in to visit them randomly. So, this girl sends me her address, and at first the address that she had sent me led me to this upper-class suburban neighborhood. I reached the address, and it was close to what I would describe as a white mansion. I called her to tell her that I was parked in her driveway, and I asked her to come outside so I could assure myself that I was at the right place. She said, "I don't see you. Are you sure you followed the directions?" Well, to avoid any more fuck-ups, she sent me her current location through iMessage. At first I found it odd, but I followed the directions to the location anyway. So, midnight rolled up, and I was on my way to her current location, which was actually kind of far from the address that she had originally sent me. As I was driving, the directions were telling me to drive off the path and into a dirt road surrounded by cornfields. This spooked me a little because I was now in the middle of nowhere, about 10 minutes from any civilization. Red flags started to go off in my head, but I ignored them because there's no way her account could have been a setup. I'd seen her pictures on Snapchat, and you can't Photoshop those as far as I'm aware. So, after driving through a dark-ass dirt road through this cornfield, the directions led me to a broken-down old house. It looked uninhabitable. There were no cars outside or in the driveway, and the only light I saw on was the porch light. I called the girl to tell her that I was outside, and she replied with, "Okay, I'll be right out." On a side note, I'm a pretty big dude and I train every day. I'm not intimidated by others, but there are some situations where you're helpless and have no option but to evade for fear of your life. So I'm waiting by my car, and I see this figure come out the front door. And it was dressed like a fucking nun. Black veil, long black dress, voodoo charms, and she's also holding a fucking voodoo doll on her left hand. I was pretty spooked out, but I thought it was just a prank. So I gave it a few seconds for the cameras to pop out, but the person just stood there, and I slowly started to realize that this wasn't a prank, because a few seconds later, I saw another figure in a similar black outfit, peeking out of a door and starting to make a run towards me with a fucking machete. I didn't even bother trying to fight back because I knew I was going to end up gutted or skinned alive by these psychos, so I immediately jumped in the car and floored it the fuck out of there. I then heard a gunshot a few seconds later behind me, and I'm in my car screaming prayers with tears in my eyes because I'm hoping to drive away with my life. Her number then kept calling me as soon as I left. I blocked it, and then another number started to call me, and I blocked that as well. I ended up staying over at my friend's house that night, and I explained everything that took place, and he wanted to go check it out together with our group of friends, but I was too terrified to even go back there. I called the police, and they went to go check it out, but the place was abandoned by the time they got there. They said that the address had been vacant for years, so they simply made a report out of it. Whoever it was never found. The whole thing was a sick setup to begin with. The girl was planning on luring me so they could do God knows what. I deleted my Tinder account. I'm pretty sure it works if you're only looking to get laid, but somehow I had the worst luck in the first time I ever decided to use it. Don't ever meet a stranger somewhere that isn't public. Shit can always go sideways. School bus driver, submitted by Skids. My parents had their second child when I was well into my teenage years. My little sister, the whoops kid. I say that jokingly because my parents love her dearly, and so do I. When she was at first grade, I started taking her to school in the morning because my job was close by the school. It made more sense to do that than to have her waiting around for the bus. I was happy to do it, and I would play music for her and make her laugh before she went into her school. My mom or dad would pick her up at the end of the day because they also had jobs that were allowing them to pick her up and not have her waiting for the bus. Just so everyone's clear, we weren't against the cheese wagon. I rode in it, but it just made a lot of sense for us to take her there and pick her up because, well, honestly, things started to get hairy in our part of town, and we didn't want her to be in any danger. So I kept this up for 2 years, but when she started third grade, my hours changed, and I was also going to community college, so I couldn't take her in the morning anymore. She did have to ride the awful cheese wagon after all, and here's where things went off the rails. One morning, she was waiting for the bus and got picked up as normal. She didn't realize that there was a different driver that day, but because all her friends were on the same bus, she didn't think twice about it. She simply got on, took her seat, and waited to be taken to school. That day, there was a special training about emergency evacuations of the school bus. They did it in the school parking lot, and they showed the kids how to open the emergency exits, the windows, the back door, the front door, the whole nine. Some of the kids were allowed to jump out of the back door, and from what I've been told, everyone was enjoying this fun little diversion that kept them out of class for a few minutes. However, this new bus driver told my little sister to stay back after all the other kids had exited the bus. He told her he needed a special helper to close the windows and close the emergency exit at the back of the bus. As any little kid who was given any amount of authority or responsibility, she eagerly helped out. She was just happy that she was the one picked to take care of the bus that took her to school and brought her home. Unfortunately, this guy got back into the driver's seat and started driving out of the school parking lot with my little sister still on the bus. She made her way up to the front and asked him, as any little kid would, "Where are we going? Why aren't you taking me to school?" He said, "I'm taking you for a special treat because you helped me with the windows and the back door." He drove out of the school parking lot, and my little sister obviously started getting nervous. This was well before the days of cell phones, and she knew something was wrong, but she had no way to call me, my mom, or my dad. The guy continued to drive around our town aimlessly for who knows how long, but I'm pretty sure he was looking for a place to do something to my baby sister. When she didn't show up in her classroom, the school called my dad to let him know that she didn't get off the bus and wanted to know if she was sick or if something else was wrong. Well, the school didn't call my parents. I happened to be home still. I happened to answer the phone, and I knew immediately something was wrong. I called my father, who was kind of hard to reach because he worked in a manufacturing plant on the floor and was not easily accessible. Before he could call me back, I hopped into my car and started looking for my baby sister. I drove her normal route to school and then started going up and down all the side streets, trying to see if maybe she was walking, or if something happened, or for whatever reason she was no longer on the bus. After about 15 minutes of looking for her, I saw her normal bus drive by me at a four-way stop. I immediately got behind it, cutting off some people, and I'm sure I pissed them off, but oh well, I was on a mission. I followed her bus for about a quarter of a mile and saw her feet walking up and down the bus aisle. I knew something was wrong. And to be honest, I wasn't 100% sure it was her, but I still saw those little feet through the little window of the back of the emergency door. The bus eventually drove into a parking lot and stopped. I followed it in and stopped my car, and to this day I am 100% sure the bus driver had no idea I was behind him, which was to my advantage, as you will see. I didn't know what happened right away, and after the incident, my baby sister would tell us what had happened, and she told my parents and the school and the police as well. The bus driver stopped the bus, got out of his seat, and walked down the aisle and grabbed her. He tried to take her clothes off, but was fumbling with her while she was screaming because she had a backpack on. Holy cow, I remember it was a Ms. Pac-Man backpack. I had gotten out of my car and only heard her terrified cries. The dumbass driver had left the door slightly ajar, which allowed me to push it open when I kicked it and get into the bus. I got on, ran up the steps, down the aisle, and flew at the guy, got him in a stranglehold, and yanked him off my baby sister and threw him into one of the seats. My poor baby sister was crying her eyes out, and while I was wailing on this fat piece of shit, I was telling her it was going to be okay and that I was here for her. In hindsight, I should have just taken care of her, but I was so pissed off that this piece of shit was going to do something to my baby sister. It felt like 2 hours, but it was probably 30 seconds before the police pulled up, jumped on the bus, and pulled me off the guy. They hauled me out of the bus. A female police officer got my baby sister, and a couple of other officers stayed on the bus with that piece of shit. Not much longer later, my dad pulled up and started asking questions about what was going on. Long story short, they let my dad take my baby sister home, let me go, but when they took that piece of shit off the bus, he looked worse than when I left him there. I'm pretty sure the cops had a fun time knocking him around. Hey, I'll say this. I'm not a huge fan of cops, but that day I was thrilled that they decided to have a little bit of justice on that fat piece of shit. The last we heard, that guy spent 2 years in jail, and that's all we know. I hope to God he is not driving a bus or in a job that has anything to do with kids. To be honest, if he was, I would not hesitate to follow him again, track him down, and beat the shit out of him all over again. Messed Up Camping Trip, submitted by Jenny O412. Hey, this happened to me in the summer of 2015. A group of my friends decided to go camping and hiking at this trail about an hour from our home. Where it was is not important, but what happened out there is. I probably should be more forthcoming about the name of the trail and the state that I'm telling this story from, but I don't want anybody to know who I am. It's not that I'm worried about myself, I just don't want any publicity. Our group got together, and we all got our stuff ready to go when we were ready to head out to the trail and go camping. There were 4 of us, 2 couples. Me, I'll call myself Jenny. My boyfriend I will call Todd. My friend Krista, and her boyfriend I'll call Bob. We were planning on hiking and camping along this trail that was a loop of about 30 miles. We were going to take it easy and go around it in about 10-mile increments. We would stop after 10 miles, set up camp at a site we could find that was open, and just hang out and have a few glasses of wine or whiskey as we enjoyed the wilderness and our company. We hit the trailhead and made our way to our first stop. There was no one there at the lean-to when we got there, and we were excited that we would be out there with just the 4 of us. Totally stoked, we set up camp. The guys got a fire going for our campfire cheer. My boyfriend Todd broke out a bottle of wine and poured everyone a glass. Right, don't take us as massive drunks, but we had an entire backpack full of wine that Todd had carried on his chest. Yeah, lulz. Anyway, we all had a few glasses of wine, and we were just winding down, watching the sunset over the trees, when we heard the snap and footsteps of someone coming up the trail towards the campsite. It was this guy. He looked disheveled and smelly, to say the least. I mean, frankly, he looked like a homeless guy that I would see on the downtown streets of the city that we lived in. Not wanting to be rude or be jerks, we invited him over to have some of our meal, which now involved hot dogs. This guy sat down, thanked us, and said that he was hiking from the north to the south all the way across the United States. He was interested in taking pictures of every place that he had been and the people that he would meet, so he asked us while he ate a hot dog if he could take pictures of us. Well, like I said, we were a couple of glasses of wine deep, so we said sure. He asked us our names, and we told him our first names but not our last names. I think we all felt that that would have been a little weird. He took some pictures of us, had another hot dog and a cookie, and then said he was going to continue to walk down the trail for another couple of miles while it was still light out. As it was dusk, it was starting to get dark while we watched the sunset, but there was still enough light for him to walk down the trail. We didn't think anything of it until Krista said, "Do you guys think that guy was weird?" I told her that he was probably just some guy that was hiking and we shouldn't think too much about it. But yeah, he did look kind of spaced out. The guys just said he looked like some dude who was high on life and probably high on the ganj and just enjoying some of his time out in the woods. I wish that had been the case, because what happened next is the reason I sent you this story. We all went to sleep a little bit later that night after taking care of our food and putting it in a bear bag and hoisting it up into a tree, and then letting the fire die down. We crawled into our tents for a much-needed sleep to get ready for the next day. But when we woke up, we all found out that leaving our boots outside of our tent was a bad idea, because the laces of our boots had been removed. I mean, literally, they were stolen. They'd been taken. We couldn't find them anywhere around our campsite, and there was absolutely no reason that we would have done that on our own as a prank. But, nonetheless, all of our bootlaces were gone. I looked at my boyfriend and said, "Todd, what the hell are we going to do now?" Todd, being the everlasting woodsman and outdoor freak, said that he actually brought extra laces, but only for 2 pairs of boots. We talked about what we were going to do, and I figured that there was a little town off the trail about 3 miles away that someone could go and get extra laces. I mean, at least that's what we were hoping. So for the next few miles until we got to that cross trail, Todd and Bob wore boots with no laces, and they were struggling. It's tough enough walking on an off-road trail, but without laced-up boots, it made it that much harder. When we got to the cross trail, which was actually a logging road, we switched laces and gave them to Krista and Bob and told them to run as fast as they could to town, which was about a mile away, and see if we could get extra laces. During that time, my boyfriend and I just hung out. Todd, God bless him, was feeling a little frisky and wanted to have a roll in the grass. We were pretty stinky from the hike so far, but I obliged, and that's exactly what we did. Right, full disclosure, I'm married now, but I still think of that time with him, and I'm pretty sure he does too. I hope that doesn't make me a slut. At any rate, Krista and Bob came back about an hour after we had made love, and they had extra laces. They weren't really the laces for our boots that we needed, but they were the kind that were waxy and would do for the rest of our trip. So we set off again for the next campsite, and none of us talking about who took our laces or what had happened during the night. As a matter of fact, Bob said that it was probably squirrels or some other forest animal that took them. We all laughed about that, but hey, who knows? We went down the trail to the next campsite, and again, when we got there, there was no one there. So we set up the same way we had the night before. We indulged in more noodles and, of course, more wine and whiskey. That's when we heard someone coming up the trail behind us. And no shit, it was the same guy from the day before. He looked the same, and we couldn't blame him because we were all wearing the same clothes too. But there he was in our midst again and acting like he had never seen us before. He gave us the same spiel as before, and we didn't know what to do other than go along with it, so we did. We gave him some food, he ate some more that he had brought, and then once again he asked us to take some pictures. At this point I was kind of wigged out and looked at Todd with a, "Hey, let's walk over there so we can talk" look. You know, the eyebrow thing. He picked up on it, and we walked away from everybody else to talk. Immediately Todd said, "Is this fucking happening? Are we seriously talking to this guy again?" I told him I felt the same way, and that's why I wanted to get away from everyone to talk about this. He said he was not okay with what was going on, but didn't want to have a huge confrontation. I told him we should just sit on it and see what happened and then go from there, even though I was kind of freaking out. Todd said that he was going to keep his 9mm on his hip from now on, rather than keeping it in his pack, and that's what he did. We went back to our campsite, Todd got his gun, and we stoked up another fire, and once again the guy wandered away up the trail. When we were sure he was out of hearing range, Todd and I talked to Krista and Bob about the whole thing, and they too were wondering what the hell was going on. That's when Krista pointed to a white piece of something on the trail, and I ran over to it. It was a Polaroid. A Polaroid of me and my boyfriend going at it. We were kind of embarrassed, but I snatched it out of her hand, stuck it in my pack, and just said, "Oh well, I guess that guy's a shutterbug," trying to play the whole thing off, meanwhile terrified into my heart. We relaxed, had another glass of wine, but a little while later we heard some horrific screaming coming from the woods, but we couldn't tell where it was coming from. They weren't human screams. They were screams of an animal. I don't know how to really describe it, but it wasn't like a human being screaming. I mean, now there's lots of animals out in that territory. I've never heard anything like that before. And Todd said we should just go to sleep, get up early and get moving. He was going to stay up late by the fire to watch over things, because he was feeling uneasy. He didn't actually say he was feeling uneasy, but I know what he was going after when he said he was going to stay up late. He wanted to protect us. The next morning, we all woke up, packed up quick, and got ready for the next part of our trek. This was our last leg through the woods before we got to a little town where we were going to stay at a motel and then get a ride back to our car. About 2 miles from the last campsite, we noticed something funny on the trees on the side of the trail. It was something I had never seen before, but the guys recognized the guts and the stomach of an animal. They were both hunters. Todd and Bob knew right away that something was out of the ordinary as these guts were hanging from the trees and stretched out to their maximum length. Krista and I didn't say anything. We were just walking along past them. Todd and Bob kind of lolled behind and then whispered something to one another. We kept walking, but I couldn't help notice that Bob also took his handgun out of his pack and holstered it. We continued walking down the trail, and we were all really feeling weirded out. I mean, something was just not right. And I'm not just talking about the stuff that was hanging in the trees or all the other stuff. We just didn't feel alone anymore. All that crap with the weirdo showing up 2 nights in a row had our minds racing. And none of us brought it up or spoke about it. But I know we were all thinking it. I mean, I know that because that's what we talked about after this whole ordeal. As we got to the main road that would take us back to the motel, we kind of stopped, and we looked back down the trail. And there he was, standing in the middle of it, with his camera up, still taking pictures of us. That guy. That creepy weirdo guy. I couldn't help but notice that his hands had blood on them. We all stood there looking at him for at least 30 seconds before he raised his hand, which was bloody, and he waved at us and then turned around and just walked back down the trail. I looked at Todd and just said, "What the fuck?" And we all decided to hightail it to the motel. We didn't even stay there. We all took showers, got cleaned up, and then called a cab company for a ride back to our car. We didn't want to spend one more instant out in that space. Who knows what the fuck that guy was doing, but holy shit, we know he was following us, and we know he was taking pictures of us the entire time. I still have that Polaroid of me on top of Todd. I hate to think that my face and the face of all my friends is somehow tacked up in some shack in the middle of the woods owned by that guy. I mean, seriously, it's been years, but what a fucking creep. An abandoned jockey truck at CB7, submitted by Painkiller. Before I became an over-the-road truck driver, I worked at the state docks on third shift. In case you don't know, I've worked the third shift by myself for about the first 6 months on the job because nobody obviously wanted to work at night. I can't honestly say that I really blame them. On this particular occasion, I had finally gotten someone to work with me. He had started the week before this happened, and with that out of the way, here's my story. I arrived at work at about 10:45 p.m. as I usually did. There was nothing particularly special about this night other than it was raining. It was about the end of November, and it had started to finally cool off in Georgia, and we were all thankful for that. Even though it had started to cool off, it was still somewhat humid, and if you're at all unfamiliar with our winter season here, the cold has a bite to it because of the humidity. This was a Friday night, and before I left my Thursday night shift on Friday morning at 8 a.m., I was told that for Saturday morning dispatch, we had 49 trucks ordered to work. However, when me and my coworker Ryan came in that Friday night, we learned that the two ships had canceled the dispatch. We were both like, cool, we can just service what comes in later and then just take our time. There were only 28 trucks that needed to be serviced, but being the third shift lead tech, I had a few other things to do with servicing the trucks. No big deal. As per usual, all the trucks came in just after midnight, so we parked them. There were only 27 trucks that came in. Well, that's strange, I thought to myself. I wonder where it's at. So I went into the dispatch office and got all the truck and trailer numbers that I had dispatched that morning, and I was most definitely missing a truck and a trailer. I had to go and find this missing unit because I could be held responsible if something happened to it, or if it was involved in an accident. I walked over to Ryan and told him to go ahead and start servicing the truck and to make sure he wrote down the hours correctly from the meter inside the trucks. I told him that I had to go and find this truck and trailer, wherever it was, and get it back to the yard. He then asked me, "How long before you come back?" It was kind of an odd question, but I answered, well, that depends on where the truck is, if it cranks or not, and if I can move it. Why? He told me he wasn't feeling well. I looked at him and asked him, then why did you come to work? He mumbled something, and I just told him to go ahead and go on home. Ryan left just before I left the yard, and I had no expectations of seeing him until Saturday night. So I got into a jockey truck that we had welded a boom arm onto that we can pick up a jockey truck and trailer it and pull it back to the yard if it was unable to start or release the brakes or was in some type of catastrophic accident that required my full attention to move it and clean up the area where it happened. Just as I had left the gate of our yard, I got a call from the port police. They asked me if I was missing a truck and trailer, and of course I told them, yes I am. The officer then told me where I could find it, and then he told me that there was also yet another truck in the same general area. I thought, great, now I'm totally fucked. The hits just keep on coming with this damn job. Not only did I now have to service 28 trucks, I also had a truck that I couldn't find at first look. I also had to get the hours on every single truck at this port, and I also had to drive about 20 minutes to the next port and get the hours on the trucks from that location. I didn't like to put off something till tomorrow that I can do today, so I chose to get them all done in one night. This was obviously not going to happen tonight. Anyway, I'm in the tow truck and driving out to the dock to check on this abandoned truck and trailer. The port has a speed limit of 25 miles an hour, but since there's not supposed to be anyone else but me and the port police on the port, I drove that tow truck with my foot buried in the floor. This particular jockey truck tow truck was able to do about 47 miles an hour when she was wide open. That doesn't sound like a lot, I know, but it's pretty damn brutal when the jockey truck has 63,000-pound leaf springs in the front and no suspension in the rear, so you could end up pissing blood for a week because it would bruise your kidneys. That particular place this abandoned truck and trailer was about 5 miles from our service yard, and as soon as I cleared the container stacks, I could see way off to my left flashing blue and red lights. I turned and headed in that direction. When I finally arrived at the truck about 2 minutes later, the cop asked me what I knew about the truck. I told him, well, all I know is I dispatched it this morning. Didn't come back with the other truck that were working this vessel. I also told him that I had no idea where it was before they called me about it. It was peculiar because the vessel was at CB2, or Container Berth 2, and this truck was obviously a few football fields away from the ship. After that brief exchange with the officer, I got to work checking the truck to determine what was wrong with it and why it was left abandoned on the dock. I tried to work as quickly as possible because, like I stated before, it was raining. I checked all of the fluid levels and saw nothing on the ground. I knew that the truck was safe to try and start, and it started right up. It had obviously been sitting for a few hours by the time I got to it, so I had to wait for the air pressure to build up before I attempted to move it. While I was waiting for that, I began to scan the area for the other truck that I was told was in the same general area. I didn't immediately see that truck, so I kind of put it in the back of my mind. Just as the cab airbag started to level the cab, I spotted someone walking behind a container stack. The port police officer had left about 10 minutes before, so I knew it wasn't him. I knew that all the longshoremen were gone, and so were the stevedores. Nobody else should have been anywhere near where I was. Port police did some rounds at night every couple hours or so, but this truck was reported to the third shift officers by the second shift in a report. I shut off the abandoned truck and jumped back into the tow truck and headed to the container stack where I had seen the person disappear. I was running the truck full tilt as fast as she would go, and by the time I got there, I saw him from my peripheral vision walking between two containers in another stack. There's about 60 feet that separate the container stacks, and this is the same for all the stacks, no matter where they were on this particular spot. So I drove to where I had seen him walk to once again. My tow truck was fitted with spotlights on the back and both sides for when I was working at night, so I turned them on. It's really easy to make your way in between containers without being seen, and whoever was doing this used that to their advantage. It was also easy to hear me coming because the diesel engine of the tow truck was so loud. For the next 20 minutes or so, this guy kept eluding me in my tow truck. It was about then that I noticed it was already 3:15 a.m., and I couldn't stay out there anymore trying to track this guy down. So I went back to the abandoned truck, hooked it up to my tow truck, picked it up off the ground, got back in and started it and released the brakes. I still remember that I had another abandoned truck in the same area and drove down to the end of CB7 to see if I could find it. I drove along the chain link fence that separated CB7 for the then under construction CB8. In doing so, I looked to my left and was looking down the container stacks to see if I could find the other missing truck. I didn't know anything about it other than the cop that reported it to me, that it was quote-unquote in the same general area. Definitely not a lot of help. As I was driving and looking with my spotlights, I saw the truck. It was totally not in the general area. The container stacks are really dark at night, so I approached it very carefully. That's very hard to do when I have two diesel engines running at the same time. It's even harder to stay quiet when I have the spitter valves blowing off excess air from the air tanks as well. Just as I got to within about 100 yards of the missing truck, I noticed that the lights were on because I could see the red lights on top of the headache rack. I didn't know if the truck was running or had run out of fuel, but I was about to find out. I guess I was about 40 yards away when the truck started to move. "What the fuck?" I said out loud to myself. "This is not good." I called the port police immediately and told them that I found the truck and there is an unauthorized person driving it. They dispatched 2 cars and I told them I was following the truck and where I was. This person, whoever he was, had gotten a considerable distance ahead of me since I was weighed down pulling another truck and trailer behind me. I was going as fast as I could given the circumstances, and just as I was coming to about the last mile to my service yard, here come the 2 police cruisers in my mirror, probably doing about 60. I reached the last curve before the yard and saw the person in the now stolen truck drive up to the service area and power slide the truck by pulling out the parking brakes, jumping out of the truck, and bolting away towards the fence. Then, before I made it to the gate, the 2 cruisers screamed past me and stopped at the truck, got out and drew their weapons. The person had run towards a gate that was locked after 4 p.m. The fence was 8 feet tall and had barbed wire and razor wire all around the top. I had finally made it into the service area and shut down the tow truck. Then, 3 more cruisers came blasting into the yard, and one of the officers told me to stay in the truck in the well-lit area of the service bay. I did as I was told. After what felt like eternity, I heard the officers yelling at someone to get out on the fucking ground, and a couple of minutes later, they were dragging a man out of the shadows that was covered in dirt and bleeding. They asked me if this was the guy I saw driving the truck, and I told them I never got a look at his face, but if that is the guy you caught, then I'm pretty sure he's the guy. All I could tell was that he was bald and was wearing a pair of coveralls. They escorted him to one of the cruisers and put him in the back seat. Then one of the officers said, "We found this knife on him. Did you see he had it?" I told them that I was unsure if he did, in fact, have any weapon on him because I didn't see it. I mean, I'm not really sure what he had in mind carrying that thing around. It was definitely not a pocket knife. It looked more like a hunting knife with a fixed blade to me. The port police asked me if I wanted to press charges, and of course I said yes. I told them to charge him with whatever they could. Not sure what that was all about, but apparently it didn't stick because he got out and returned to his job with the Longshoremen's Hall about a month later, and he had the nerve to show up at my window to be assigned to truck and trailer. I refused to dispatch him and had the port police remove him from the property. The longshoreman's pit license was revoked, and then he lost his port credentials. This forced him out of a job. He never returned to my dispatch window the remainder of the time that I worked there. When I came into work that next Saturday night, I told Ryan what had happened the night before. He was always kind of a nervous guy, and I'm glad he wasn't on the yard when this happened. He would have probably gotten hurt pretty bad. He wasn't one of those people who kept calm under pressure or in a situation like that. If he had been there, I'm going to bet that that would have been his last night, but they made me lead tech for a reason. Along with the port police report I had to submit to the office, I had to submit my own report as well. And no, this is absolutely not the last creepy story from my time working third shift at the port. I've got more to come. Bigfoot or something else? Submitted by Anonymous. I know you know my real name, but I'm asking that you not use it for Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories, for the story that I've submitted. I love camping and hiking stories just as much as the next guy, and I felt compelled to share something terrifying that happened to me and my best friend in 2001. My best friend and I decided to go out and do some hiking and camping for a few days in the state of Washington where we lived. We were 26 at the time, both newly married, and both our wives had given birth to our first children in the last 2 years. They were going to get together with the kids a few times and do mom stuff while we took a break from both working and caring for the kids. We married really great women to allow us to do this. We knew we wanted to travel light, but we were going tent camping, so we kept most of our food and stuff to dehydrated meals and easy-to-make things like rice and noodles and so on. I was also a huge salami freak, so I made sure to pack a lot of that sort of thing with cheese and other goodies like chocolates and trail mix, stuff like that. We were going to do everything on our little packable stoves, so we also had extra bottles of fuel, and that was about it for the heavy stuff. We did bring along our shotguns that we strapped to our backpacks, and we picked an extremely remote area to go as we didn't want to see other people, just wanted to enjoy nature and our conversations. I had also recently purchased a digital camera and thought I could snap pictures of the things that we found along our stay. I don't know if anyone remembers how big digital cameras were back then, but it was a compromise with extra weight. But being a tech geek, I was really into that sort of thing and could not pass up the chance of bringing it along. My best friend, whom I will call John for this story, also brought along his black lab, Smokey. That also meant extra weight for him to carry with dog food and treats. But Smokey was like a third brother to us, and he loved to hike and camp as much as we did. I left my golden retriever at home. She was amazing, but Ginger was not a huge camping dog. Her style was more of a lay around the house and get fawned over style. So we loaded everything up the night before in John's Jeep and decided to head out pretty early. It was a Thursday morning when we left off, and other than stopping for some coffee and snacks for the ride, we set out and we were on our way. We only stopped one time for lunch, and we just kept talking about how awesome this was going to be and what a blast we were going to have. We got to a spot where we could park and get going on foot, and we were thrilled to see that there were no other cars around. Even in the most remote areas of this country, it seems like there's always some kind of asshole out there that you'll come across to ruin the time that you're having. I'm not trying to be negative, it's just the truth. It's like the old adage, if you get lost, sit down and start playing solitaire, and someone is sure enough to come up and tell you that you've made the wrong move. Our plan was to hike out about 4 hours the first day and camp early, wake up early the next day, and continue on to another spot before staying there for 2 days, and then just doing the reverse to get back to the Jeep. It was gorgeous weather. It was summertime and everything was deep green, smelled amazing, and it was just so cool to hear the sounds of the forest and feel the breeze when you got out of the trees, crossing fields and stopping at the rivers and streams that we came up to clean up and get more water. If anybody cares, I had brought along a supply of iodine tablets for our water supply just in case, but John was also testing out this new water filtration pump that seemed to work pretty good. Anyway, we stopped at a place to camp that was very suitable for what we wanted, unpacked our stuff, and got ready to set up camp. We pitched our tent, John tended to Smokey, and I took a small hatchet and started gathering tinder, kindling, and firewood for the evening. It was probably around 4 when I heard something way off in the distance. Now, if you've ever been way out in the wilderness, you can hear all kinds of animals up close and from far away, and second guess what it actually is. Sound travels very differently out there, and what you might think is one kind of animal could actually be something very, very different. John and I had been hunting with our father since we were kids and had been out in areas like this we were out in right now for all of our lives. We are by no means experts on flora and fauna, but we know enough to make educated guesses as to what things are. As I was chopping up a small log and taking off its dead branches, I heard what sounded like a deep howl way off in the distance. It was sort of a howl ending with a whoop. It lasted for a good 8 seconds, and I sat listening, thinking maybe it was a bear, but if so, that's a pretty loud bear. I waited for about a minute, and it came again, way off in the distance. I sat there listening, but I didn't hear it for another 5 minutes and got back to work. I was just going to ask John if he had heard it. I wasn't too far from our campsite, so he had to have heard it. I dragged some more deadfalls back up to our campsite and unloaded all of the branches I had collected. Before I could say anything, John asked me, "Hey, Gary, did you just hear that howling?" I said, "Yeah, I was going to ask you. What do you think it was? A bear?" John said, "I don't know. If it was, it's an unbelievably large bear or something's wrong with it." Right away, we ruled out cougars or coyotes, as they don't sound anything like that. Well, we heard it, and it became a topic of conversation as he got some food started and was playing around with Smokey, keeping him occupied. After a while, we kind of let it go and just started eating and talking about what we were going to do the next day. We sat around the fire for a little while and let it die down before retiring for the night. We crawled into our tent with Smokey at our feet, and it didn't take long to fall asleep after the trip and the hike out there. Sometime during the night, I woke up thirsty and reached for my water bottle. It was really quiet, and outside the sound of the wind through the trees was so comforting. I took another swig and was just about to lay back down when I heard that howl again, way off in the distance. I sat motionless, thinking about what the heck it could be. I didn't want to wake up John, and Smokey was sound asleep too. I saw no point in bothering either of them. So I waited and waited, but didn't hear it again. I just went back to sleep and slept soundly for the rest of the night. When I woke up, first thing I said to John was, "Hey, I heard that howl again last night." I woke up for a drink of water, and it was the same sound, and it sounded like it was coming from the same distance away. He looked at me and said, "No kidding." "Well, whatever it is, I hope we don't run into it." Prophetic words. We got some breakfast, checked our gear, and then packed everything up. We started our trek to the next spot, and again had an unbelievably enjoyable day as we made our way to where we would make camp again. We stopped for lunch and consulted a topo map and spotted a place that looked ideal for a 2-day stay. It was near a stream, and there was a pond about a quarter of a mile away. It was in a meadow on the edge of a forest, sort of like the night before, but now we had water. It took another hour to get to the spot, and when we found the right place, we again set up camp. Pitched our tent, stored our gear, gathered wood, and so on. And that's the way the afternoon went. We decided to have an early dinner and then just hang out by the fire. John had not told me that he had brought a little liquid refreshment for us. We could just enjoy the evening talking and sipping on a little Johnny Walker Black. I made some noodles with salami. I know that sounds gross, but trust me, it was delicious. We ate, and then I started a fire. Smokey was acting a little restless, so John decided to take him for a walk down to the stream and let him play a little bit more, even though he had walked as far as we had. He was a pretty good-sized lab, probably about 65 pounds, and in very good shape. But for whatever reason, he had just not had his exercise fix for the day. I sat in front of the fire whittling a stick just for fun. And then I couldn't believe my ears. That howl came again, but it was a hell of a lot closer than it was the night before. I knew immediately that it was no bear. This was no animal that walked on 4 legs. I know that sounds weird, but it had this massive bass to it, and this time, how it ended in 3 distinct whoops. It seemed like all of the other sounds of nature stopped. At least they did for me, as I was focusing my attention on that. I waited for it to come again, but it didn't. However, John came running up with Smokey, and I knew he was about to ask me if I had heard it. Before he could say anything, I said, "Yeah, I heard that." The debate started again as to what it was. And just for precautions, we made sure that our shotguns were ready if we needed them. We weren't so worried about being attacked by an animal, but who knows if some whack job was out there making those noises. I mean, I suppose it could have been a man, but in retrospect, and what happened a little bit later, we now know it wasn't. We had our fire and just kept talking about that and sipping on the Johnny Walker. Conversation finally drifted to other things, like our jobs and families, and we kind of forgot about the howling. As the fire dwindled and we got ready to hit the sack, I wandered off to commune with Mother Nature, and that's when the howl came again, this time ending with only 1 whoop. But what was new this time was, a little farther away, we heard another howl, a little higher pitched, with no whoop at the end. I hurried up, finished my business, and got back to the safety of what little fire we had left. I gotta admit, I was a little spooked. If this was man-made, well, now that made 2 of them out there in the dark, making funny noises. And really, for what reason would they be doing that? I mean, for whose entertainment would it be for? John started nodding his head, and then said, "Gary, I think it's a good idea if we bring the shotguns inside the tent with us tonight." I agreed, and after a little bit more conversation, we crawled in the tent and went to sleep. Even though we had worked hard all day, sleep was hard coming that night. I just couldn't fall asleep. I finally did, but not long later I woke up to Smokey growling lowly. His head was up and looking towards the left wall of the tent. John had obviously heard it too, and sat up on his elbows. There was a little moon out, so there was some light coming from the outside, and we saw Smokey dip his head once more, but all the while still growling. Then something hit my nostrils that almost made me puke. It was this horrendous smell, like a dead skunk wrapped in garbage and then set in the sun for a few days. I mean, this smelled so damn bad I actually gagged. John had actually pulled out a handkerchief and had placed it over his nose, and even Smokey's nose was twitching. I mean, something smelled like holy hell. We sat listening and looking at each other and wondering what the hell was going on. Finally I whispered, "Maybe there's a deer carcass or something upwind, and now it's just flowing down to us." I know that was kind of a weak thing to say, but I didn't know what else to say. John said, "Yeah, maybe that's possible, but even though, I think we would have noticed something earlier today." Smokey stopped growling and started to put his head back down as if he was going to sleep. And that's when the howl came again, this time up close and personal. Whatever this thing was, man or animal, it was not far away at all. And again, we sat there, and finally, John said, "Gary, what are we going to do?" I rolled over to get my shotgun and sit it across my lap as I was now sitting up. "Well," I said, "if something's coming near us, I suppose a few rounds will scare it off." He agreed, and did the same thing as me, picking up his 1187. We sat in silence for what seemed like an hour, and nothing came. The smell had left by now, but we were kind of keyed up, and I decided to stay up a little longer to see if anything would happen, and told John he could get some sleep. As we weren't going to be leaving the campsite for another day, I figured I could just take a nap later that morning or even in the afternoon. I stayed up for another 3 hours listening and frankly waiting, but nothing happened. It was now 4 in the morning, and it would be dawn soon. I was tired at this point, so I laid back down to get a few winks in, and I hadn't been out for more than a half hour when John was violently shaking my arm. I rolled up to say what, and he told me to be quiet. Smokey had his head up again, and now had that low growl going, but that's not what I noticed at first. In the pre-dawn light, something was outside of our campsite. It was to the east of us, but we could hear something walking through the edge of the forest and into the meadow where we were. We both grabbed our shotguns and chambered slugs. We sat quietly until we heard these footsteps somehow get louder and faster. I mean, they were really pounding on the ground and shaking it. Here's where we had to start making some decisions, because something big that we didn't know what it was came running through our campsite. It ran right by us, and Smokey jumped up and started barking, and that stench came back. It lingered for a bit before going away as the footsteps receded into the distance. I don't curse that much, but I looked at John and said, "What the fuck was that?" He just shook his head. We sat there waiting to see if something else was going to happen, but it didn't. The sun came up and it seemed like all was well. Smokey started fidgeting like he had to go to the bathroom, and as much as I had to talk myself into going out of the tent, I knew that nothing was wrong out there. I was working myself up, probably over a coyote or some kind of other animal that ran through the campsite. Oh, the things you will do and say to yourself to avoid talking about a situation that you don't want to. We both crawled out of the tent, and Smokey ran out to do his thing, and as soon as he was done, started sniffing around the ground like crazy. I mean, he was really going to town like he was on the hunt for something. I stretched, looked at John as he called for Smokey, and then started walking towards him. But then he stopped dead in his tracks. In the light dusting of the dirt which we had set up camp on, there were huge footprints. I mean, big footprints. And they looked human, almost. However, they were 17 inches long. We did our best to guesstimate by putting our feet next to them, and there were a series of them with extremely long strides between them. I took out my digital camera and started taking pictures. I had John put his hand and foot next to one of them and took a picture of that. We both looked at each other, and he finally said, "Gary, are you thinking what I'm thinking?" I was, but I didn't want to admit that we were looking at something we had always thought was a bunch of fairy tales. As I mentioned, we grew up in this area, in the wilderness, so we were more than familiar with the folklore and all the stories these weirdos talk about seeing something in the forest and calling it Bigfoot. But now, there we were, looking at some really big feet. I said we needed a cup of coffee and something to eat to properly mull this over. I mean, my first inclination was to be scared and say, "Let's get the hell out of here." But after we talked about things for the better part of an hour and a half, John said, "What if you could get a picture of it?" I said, "Are you nuts?" And he said, "Well, look, it ran right through here and could have done some pretty serious damage, but it didn't. I mean, maybe it's just been checking us out and wanted to see who we are and what we're up to." I started to see his point, but I also started to think, yeah, well, if it's something that big and it decides to change its mind, we're up shit creek without a paddle. John simply pointed to our shotguns propped up against our packs and said, "I'm pretty sure we could scare it off if we had to." We decided to think about it and go for a short walk to the stream to replenish our water and just check things out down there. It was also a good way for Smokey to run around. We finally came to the decision we were going to continue our trip as we had planned and stay out there for one more night. I'm sure as you are reading this, Uncle Josh, you're probably saying to yourself, these guys are out of their heads. And I'm sure people who are listening to this are saying the same thing. But we were 26 and thinking, how amazing would it be if we were the guys to come up with real evidence for something like Bigfoot? We also talked about what else it could have been, but we thought that was stupid because we saw the footprints and we had pictures of those. There was nothing else that this could be. So we went through the day doing other activities, but our minds were on if that thing was coming back and if we would be ready for it. We gathered more wood late in the day for another fire and decided to stay up later to see if anything would happen. It started to get on towards 9, and it was dark, and we were waiting for the moon to come up. The anticipation of something happening is sometimes harder to deal with than something actually happening. I couldn't take the tension and had a swig of the Johnny Walker, and so did John. And that's when we heard a louder howl coming from the area where the pond was. It did it more than once, and I thought that if we could sneak over there and take whatever it was by surprise, we could get a shot. I mean, we had no idea about how Bigfoot hears or sees or whatever. We only had experience with animals and their highly tuned senses. What if this thing was just like a human being that we knew we could sneak up on? We decided we would do that and leave Smokey in the tent. However, that turned out to be non-fruitful. As we made our way towards the pond and hearing the howl once more, Smokey had escaped the tent and started running towards us, and then right by us. He was trying to follow the howl, and for the first time was not listening to John's calls. He was not coming back for any reason. We started running after him, and John kept saying, "Why didn't I chain him up? Why didn't I chain him up?" And I told him, "Don't worry about it." It didn't take us too long to go the roughly quarter mile to the pond when we heard a massive howl, the loudest one we'd ever heard, and then the sound of Smokey crying out, and then the sound of a massive splash in the water. We didn't even look at each other and immediately sprinted towards the edge of the pond. In the dim moonlight, we saw Smokey swimming towards shore, and John frantically calling him back with his commands. Smokey got out of the water, crawled up the small bank, and then ran towards us and immediately sat at John's feet, panting heavily with this crazed look in his eye and foam on his mouth. It took me over a minute to notice the giant figure standing literally 20 yards away from us, just standing looking at us. I couldn't make out any features, just this massive shape. I mean, it had to have been at least 8 feet tall, I could tell that. The moonlight did let us see that it was covered with hair, and I can only describe it as massive. It didn't make any sounds. It just stood there for another minute or so, and then turned around and walked off along the edge of the pond away from us. A few minutes later, we heard the higher-pitched howl a little ways away from us, and then the louder, lower bass howl back, obviously closer to us, as it must have been the thing that we had just seen. I'm not crazy. I know some people who I've told this story to say I am, but John was there too, and whatever it was that happened to Smokey, we can only speculate. But from the way it sounded like whatever this thing was startled by the dog, and either picked him up and threw him or hit him so hard that he flew out into the pond. That time, I never once thought that I should follow whatever it was, and I'm going to refer to it as Bigfoot, because it had to have been. We waited until the next day to go back, to see those same huge footprints around the sand around the areas of the edge of the pond. But at that evening, we went back to the camp, stoked up the fire as high as we could get it, and I skirted the edge of the forest within eyeshot of our camp to get more wood. We were staying up all night. We didn't hear anything else, and the next day we quickly picked up and got out of there. We stayed at the first camp the last night again with nothing happening. We considered just hiking all the way back to the Jeep, but we knew that we wouldn't have the energy to do that and then make the trip home. Again, I know people say I'm crazy and question what really happened, saying if that was them, they would have gotten out of there right away. For some reason outside of the fact that it did something to Smokey, it didn't seem like it was violent or looking to hurt us. We think it was just curious. The trip ended with our hike back to the Jeep and then our drive home. I reviewed the pictures of the footprints, and I did send them to an organization for their thoughts, and they basically just said, "Yep, that looks like Sasquatch. You mind if we share these with others?" I laughed and said, "That's fine, but don't use my name." I still have those pictures and the memories of what happened to us, and that's all I need. So that's my Bigfoot story. I'm still an avid camper, hiker, and hunter, and I've been in lots of places all over the Northwest and talked to a lot of people who have said that they've seen something similar to what we did. I was a non-believer, but now I am a full-fledged believer, because I know what happened to us out there. I'm not afraid of the woods, and I'm not afraid of running into another Bigfoot. But in a strange way, sometimes I hope I do. Don't Trust Everyone You Meet, submitted by Ernie Ballfan. I apologize for this being so long. You can edit and cut it down if you feel like it, but I hope you read it. In the late 90s, I found myself without a place to stay. It was of my own doing, but when you find out that your wife of 5 years has been cheating on you, and your only recourse is to leave, well, that's the way it is. I was living in New York City at the time, trying to make a living as a musician, both original songwriter and studio work. My wife and I had gone to college together and had been together for 3 of the 4 years that we attended. We stayed together after graduation for another 3 before deciding to get married. As I mentioned, everything finally went south. She ended up sleeping with a few different guys and then threw it in my face that I was never home with her. Let me just say that being a musician or being married to a musician is not the easiest thing in the world. Your hours are crazy, you're always at music venues or bars or working in a studio at odd hours to fill the needs of whoever is asking you to be there. I was, and by no means am, a super famous musician that a lot of your listeners would recognize. But I can say that probably some of them have heard my work somewhere or another, whether on a record album or in a commercial. I still do it for a living, and I enjoy a decent lifestyle. Okay, that has nothing to do with the story, but I suppose it gives a little backstory. When I found out my wife was cheating on me, I obviously was devastated and realized that I needed to get out. What she had done was way beyond forgiveness, and I made the right decision then and there to walk away. The problem was, our place in Brooklyn was in her name, and there wasn't much I could do about getting the lease turned over to me. After many days and nights of fighting and yelling, I just picked up and left. Thank God we didn't have kids. Eventually we did sort things out, but this story is about my travel to the West Coast, and what happened to me on the way. One morning, I decided that since all my commitments at the studios had been taken care of, and I had no gigs lined up, I simply packed up all my gear in my Blazer, wrote a fuck you letter to my now ex-wife, and I started my drive to LA. I stopped in Pittsburgh to see some friends and told them what was happening with me and my ex, and I stayed with them for a couple of days. I should mention I was 28 at the time, so kind of young but also pretty street smart and knowing what time it was. I figured I'd try to see if there was a way for me to make some money on the road to help out with my personal bank account that I was going to be relying on for quite some time. So I stayed in Pittsburgh. My friends hooked me up with a couple of places that I could play for a few bucks. After those couple of days, I finally made my way out, and I got to a little town in Indiana. It's an area that I will not mention for very obvious reasons. When I got there, it was kind of late, I was tired and hungry. So I decided to stop there for the night. Found a place that had rooms to rent, as there were no hotels in town. I mean, this place was the epitome of bumfuck nowhere. In the daylight hours, I would find out that there was nothing but farming. A small manufacturing facility, a couple of diners, restaurants, and bars, but that was about it. Honestly, the biggest form of entertainment in the town was a roller skating rink. That gives you an idea of where I was. So after I got my stuff in my room, I decided to walk down the main street where really that's the only thing that seemed to be open. Oh, fuck, there was nothing else to be open. I went to this bar and grill, sat down at the bar and ordered a beer. The bartender was this really nice guy around my age and asked if I wanted something to eat, and I said yeah, so he got me a menu. I just started doing the whole, hey, where are you from? What are you doing here kind of a conversation. That always seems to happen in the little towns when a stranger rides in. I gave him the fast version of my country western song, as I called it, and he laughed and said, yeah, that kind of sucks. I kind of know how you feel. My brother went through something similar right here in town, and he doesn't live here anymore. He moved down south to get away from his wife. When he asked if I was going to stay the night, I said, I'd really like to see if I could pick up a temp job for a couple of days and maybe make some more cash. I asked him, you know anybody around here that would hire somebody as an extra hand for a day or so? He said some of the farmers were always looking for guys and that he could ask around with some of them who he knew would be coming in later that night. We got to talking music and I told him that that's what I did for a living, and he just said, no shit. And he said, once in a while we do live music here, but it's so far from a lot of other places, it's hard to get guys to come out in the middle of nowhere where we are. He asked what I played, and I told him, and he said, seriously? And I said, yeah. And he said, you up for an audition? I think I might be able to solve your problem. So basically, I ran back to my truck, grabbed one of my acoustics from its locked case, and walked back to the place. There wasn't a lot of people there yet. It was a Thursday night. But I'll never forget, I played him a Hank Williams Jr. tune, a Tom Petty tune, and then a slower Garth Brooks tune, the one that's called Somewhere Other Than the Night. He just looked at me and said, "Well, I'll be damned, you weren't kidding." A couple of the other people that were there shooting pool had stopped and listened, and they also clapped. The bartender, who I'll call Russ for this story, said, "I tell you what, tomorrow night you can play here. I've got an old speaker system and some microphones, and I'll give you 3/4 of what I get at the door. If it works out and you feel like it, come back on Saturday night for the same thing." I just looked at him, and he said, "Does that sound good?" I was blown away. I couldn't believe how nice this guy was being and how perfect this was working out. I told him, honestly, 3/4 of the door is a lot, and he said, "Hey, don't worry, you know where you are. I think you can imagine how much people drink around here. I'll do fine at the bar." I asked him how many people he could get in there, and he said, between 150 and 200. My joint's the only one that stays open past 11. I did some mental math and figured if he was charging like $3 at the door, I could clear like $600. For 2 nights' work back in a place like that and I'd never been, I thought that was pretty good. It got to be around 11, and I was even more tired, but figured I'd have one more beer, and some of the other locals had been filtering in and saw my guitar next to me and asked if I was playing. Russ just looked at him and said, "Not tonight, but tomorrow you gotta come back and hear this guy." They said, "Is he any good?" Russ just nodded and said, "Yeah, I think he's real good." They just gave me another look like I was from another planet and said, "All right," and wandered back to the pool tables. Russ and I worked out a deal that I would go on at 9:30, play for an hour or so, take a short break, and then play another set as long as I wanted to. We shook hands, and I said I couldn't thank him enough for this hospitality, and he just said, "No, you know what? It's nice to have someone from not around here, and the fact that you can play some music for all of us country boys is really great." I was on cloud 9. I walked back to my room, went through a few of my old songbooks I had brought with me to try to remember some of the tunes that I had played, because I wanted to do more country stuff and not as many originals, obviously. I finally went to sleep and slept great. The next morning, I got showered, went back downtown and found a greasy spoon for some breakfast, and saw that Russ had put up a sign in the window of his place that said "Live Music Tonight." I smiled and thought that was really cool. After breakfast, I went and got a haircut, and it seemed like everybody knew that I didn't belong there and was wondering who I was by the way they were looking at me. Things were going cool at this point, but they were to take a creepy turn pretty quick. That night I went to the bar, and Russ had set up some small PA speakers and had 2 microphones. I adjusted one for my guitar, one for my Vox, and I ran them through this really old amplifier that I was sure was not going to work. But when I started strumming and singing and playing around with the mix, it didn't sound too bad. He gave me a thumbs up from the bar, and I was ready to go right at 9:30. It was a good time. I was nervous at first because of a different crowd, but as more and more people came in, the more I relaxed and just got into a groove. People kept coming up and requesting songs I didn't know, and they just kept saying, "Well, you can play them when you come back next time." It honestly was just like that line out of the Blues Brothers, and it made me smile, like I was going to come back to this place after I got to California. During my first break, a woman came over to me and said, "Hey, I really like how you sound," and introduced herself as Lynn. Oh boy, let me tell you about Lynn. She was very cute and very nice, but very flirtatious, and I noticed that straight away she wanted all of my attention. That should have been a red flag. We talked for a while before I had to go back up, and she said, "Maybe we can talk when you're done." I said, "Sure. I mean, what else was I going to say?" So I went back up and played for another hour and a half with more requests and songs I didn't know. I wrapped up, and the place was closing at 1, so Russ and I squared up money, and he was 100% straight with me. He gave me $350. I've played a lot of gigs before and after this, and for a middle of a nowhere joint to hand over that kind of money in the 90s was unheard of. There were gigs that I had played locally and weekly in New York that I didn't get that much money for one night's work, but I wasn't complaining. So I think you can see where this story might be going now when I say that Lynn came back over to talk to me some more, and we had a couple of beers as things were winding down and people were leaving. Russ said, "Hey, offer's open, man. You want to come back tomorrow?" I said, "Sure." Lynn asked me if I would walk her home as she usually had someone do that, and why wouldn't it be me? I did, and of course my hormones took over when I realized what she was looking for all along. I spent the night with her and got up in the morning to leave, and she asked if I wanted to get together again later that night. I said, sure, I gotta play first, but that'd be cool if you came back. In the back of my mind, I was thinking I might just get my money and get on the road, even though it would be late. I tried to remember some of the songs people asked me to play when I went back to my room, but before I could do that, I walked past my truck to get another guitar out. I couldn't help but notice that there were not one, but 2 dead skunks on the hood and windshield of my truck. It smelled fucking awful. The town was so small, it didn't have a car wash or anything like that. But as I drove around looking, I went past a farm where I saw a guy using a power washer on some equipment. I pulled up, I asked him if I could use his for $20, and he was really cool. Said, sure, and I can help you. He had some heavy-duty cleaner that he had dumped on my truck, and I sponged it around trying to get the smell gone, and I cleaned up everything else, too. I mean, it worked pretty good, but that smell is so hard to get out. He asked, how the hell did that happen? I said, I don't know. I came out to my truck this morning and saw that they were there. He shook his head and said, man, that's a damn shame. We shook hands, exchanged names, I gave him the $20, and I thanked him over and over again, and he said, no, that's all right. And then I went back to my room. Later, I went out to get another bite to eat, and when I went back to my room, once again I noticed something wrong with my truck. 2 of the tires were deflated, and there were some words in the dust that had already been kicked up onto the tailgate. It just said, get out while you can. Like a moron, I limped the truck up the street to the only gas station in town, and they helped me fill my truck tires with air. After that, I drove to the small parking lot next to the bar and left it there after getting my guitars out and taking them to my room. I figured if I left it there, more people would see it, and whoever was fucking with it wouldn't be so bold to do it in a populated area. And then again, when I say populated, I mean somebody walking by every 15 minutes or so. That night again was great. I made another $300, shook hands with Russ and a bunch of people from the town who were really nice to me and said, you know, I may be back someday. A bunch of people asked where I was headed, and I told them my story, and they wished me good luck. Lynn was there, of course, and I went home with her again, of course, being the idiot that I was. We had sex again, and sometime a couple of hours later, I heard a noise in her bedroom, which was a house in a little shady street off the main drag. I thought it was just her getting up. Nope. To be honest, I never even got or saw these guys' faces. I was dragged off the bed, slammed down onto the floor, and immediately got pummeled. I mean, this was an ass-kicking of a lifetime. I was kicked in the head, in the back, God, even in my ass, everywhere. While I kept yelling, stop, stop, what the hell? I was dragged out of the bedroom, cracked my head on the doorframe, and was dragged into the living room, where there was a lamp on in the corner. The 2 guys stood over me and said, we told you to get out, or else. Now you better fucking do it, boy. One guy plunged a knife right into the floor next to the side of my head. I nearly shit myself. Throughout all of this, I looked over and noticed that Lynn was calmly sitting on a couch not 5 feet from me watching. The 2 guys turned around quickly and left me there bleeding, and I rolled over onto my side away from the knife. I looked up at her and said, what the fuck was that? She just lit up a cigarette, looked at me and said, oh, that's my ex-boyfriend. He gets a little jealous. I looked back at her and said, you're not going to fucking help me? And you're fine with them kicking the shit out of me? I'm not making this up. She just shrugged and said, well, not much I can do. Every time I go to the police, they just let him go. And again, I'm not lying. And to this day, I swear to God, I heard her mutter under her breath, but loud enough for me to hear, at least he didn't kick my ass tonight. I went to the bathroom and saw my face was swelling up, but didn't have any teeth missing. Outside of the cut on my head from banking it off the door, I knew I would heal up, and I only suffered a bunch of bruises. I knew I was going to be sore the next day. Guys were pretty smart. Didn't leave any serious marks. But then again, who the fuck was I going to go to and report this? I just grabbed my stuff, walked out the door without even saying anything to Lynn, as she just sat there smoking. Went back to my room, took another shower, left the money I owed for the next day, and then went out to my truck at the bar. There was another truck blocking it in, and my heart sank. As I walked up to it, I couldn't see in the window, so I just put my clothes and stuff in the front seat of mine, not caring to pack it properly. I didn't even look over when I heard the window roll down on the passenger side of the truck behind me. In the same voice that I'd heard in Lynn's living room, they just said, "Good choice. Get out." The truck backed up and I didn't say another word, just got into my blazer and started making my way down this main street before stopping to check my map. I knew I had to travel a little bit before finding another crossroad to get me back onto the interstate, and that truck followed me all the way down the street and stopped right behind me when I parked. When I figured out where I had to go, I got out of town and the road widened a little bit, but that truck stayed right on my ass for a mile or two outside of town. Then it pulled up alongside me and started doing that jerking motion over towards me like they were going to try to run me off the road, but they didn't quite do it. They came pretty damn close. I was freaking out. How long were these guys going to follow me? Were they going to wait until we were far out of town, knock me off the road, and kill me? Fuck, I wasn't putting anything out of my mind at that point. Finally, I got to the crossroads of where I needed to go, so I slowed down, hit my turn signal, but the truck stayed on the side of me, and then a bunch of beer cans hit the hood of my truck, and I heard them laughing. When I made the turn, the truck, thank God, didn't follow me, and I got back on the interstate with no problem. I drove until noon the next day, wanting to put as many miles behind me of that town as I could. I didn't mean this story to be one about getting down on a little hick town, because I've played a lot of them, and I've played in much hairier and scarier neighborhoods all through California, the Midwest, and the Southwest. Hell, that place made some places in Chicago look like heaven. A lot of places are scarier than that, but at the time in my life, it was by far the most terrified I had ever been. I mean, even after the beating, I could not get it out of my head that they were going to do something else when we finally got out on the open road. Just goes to show you, no matter where you go, there are really great people and there are really bad people. It's not like they're all living in one area. It's been nearly 30 years since that happened, and I've actually written 2 songs about it. I still play professionally. Never really did make it big, but I've made a name for myself out there too, and I'm making a very nice living. Once in a while, I'll even play one of those songs that I wrote. But when I do look back, I still have so many thoughts bouncing around in my head. I mean, what if I had put up more of a fight? What if I hadn't have left that town right away? Would anyone really have helped me if I had gotten really messed up? I mean, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I honestly think there was a possibility that I might just have disappeared out in the middle of nowhere. I guess the moral of the story is, don't be so trusting, even when other people are treating you well. No matter where you go, there's always a snake in the grass. Scary Camping Trip, submitted by Shay. Last May, I went on a camping trip with one of my friends who I've known since 7th grade for 2 reasons. One being that her and her family always go to this camping trip every summer, and the other reason being that we were graduating high school. It was at a campsite in Colfax, California, by the Bear River, which was in walking distance of the river and was surrounded by breathtaking landscapes. To get to our site, we had to drive up a somewhat windy road that took us right to a small parking lot, which directly faced our site and was connected by a little bridge with a creek running underneath. When me and my friend Sam arrived, her mom and her friends had already set up their tents and were chilling at a table playing a card game while eating snacks and playing some country music. We got to our spot and saw a man and a woman a few sites away from us, but we could tell they weren't supposed to be there. You see, in order to stay at these campsites, you have to pay to stay at each site, and I don't mean to sound like I'm making false assumptions about people, but it was obvious that they weren't supposed to be there, as they looked like they hadn't showered in a while, and were going to sleep in a hammock between 2 trees, in spite of how cold it got at night. Plus, the man had a small but what looked like a very sharp machete that he was using to cut down some of the bushes and little trees over by where they were. Me and Sam actually didn't think much of it at first, but her mom and her mom's friend came over to us and talked about how, it didn't seem like they belonged there. We didn't want to interfere with them. In other words, go over there and tell them to get the hell out. So, later on, the four of us drove down to a beach area to just chill at the river. As we were driving, we saw the park ranger driving our way, so Sam's mom stopped the ranger and told him about the people by our site, and how they could be in a site that other people had already paid for. Plus, the guy had a freaking machete cutting down trees and stuff as if he was an Indiana Jones. The ranger thanked her for letting him know, and that he would go take care of it. Relieved of the worry that random people with a machete were no longer going to be there, we went to the beach, sat in our chairs in the water, and just sat back, talked, and watched the absolutely gorgeous view of all the forestry around us, as well as the cold blue water steadily rushing by. Everything was peaceful, until the next day, Saturday. Sam and I were sitting at our table playing Yahtzee and listening to our beloved underground rap music, and this huge RV pulled up in the parking lot. This Australian couple came out and talked to Sam's mom and her friends. It seemed to be a very nice couple who were taking a trip across the U.S. But of course, being the spooky person I am, thought, what if they were actually campsite murderers that befriend people around them and then slaughter them in their sleep? I told my friend that, and she said she was thinking the same thing. We both laughed and joked about it for a little bit, knowing that the seemingly crazy conspiracy might just have been true. After the couple went back to their RV, my suspicions of them still stuck in my mind, but faded as nighttime came upon us. Another couple set up camp where the other two had put their hammock the day before. Sam and I set up our own campfire. We ate dinner, roasted marshmallows, and talked about high school. It was finally coming to an end, and we were talking about the future. All of a sudden, Sam looks as she was facing the small bridge and said, "What the hell?" So I turn around and see the same man from the day before that was there with his girlfriend, walking over the bridge, passing by us to the new couple, who were also at the time eating their dinner by their bonfire. Strangely enough, the guy walked up to the couple, sat by the fire, and they gave him a plate of food. They conversed for about half an hour while the man ate. Sam and I were confused as to where that guy's girlfriend was. She was nowhere in sight, and why he had gone straight to that couple. Sam's mom walked up to us and was also confused as to why he was there again, and wondered how that he and the couple knew each other. The whole vibe was really weird, to say the least, so Sam's mom offered to move our tent to where her mom and her friends' tents were. We insisted everything was okay. Her mom walked back over to their table, and the guy walked back to his notably red truck, still with no girlfriend in sight, and he just drove down the road. This is where things really get weird. I watched him go down the road. However, I saw that the taillights blinked, indicating that he had stopped in the middle of the road. Might I add, the road was pitch black and added to the creepiness, so I just said, "Did you see that?" And Sam said, "No, what happened?" I told her that he had stopped in the middle of the road, and she was also like, "What the fuck?" I never saw him drive away, but apparently he did, because about 10 minutes later, he slowly drove back up to the parking lot, stopped his car towards our direction, then turned around and then drove down the road. Sam and I looked at each other again like, "What the fuck?" And she said, "Did you guys see that?" And she was talking to her mom and friends, and they said they did see it. A few minutes later, he did the same thing, slowly drove up, briefly stopped his truck, and then drove back down the road. He kept doing that every 10 or 20 minutes, and that conspiracy that me and Sam thought about came back to haunt us. Now she was freaking out, and I was kind of laughing it off, but I got to admit I was getting a little anxious. My body even showed it because my fingertips and toes had gotten super cold, which always happens when I get anxious. Then, of course, Here he comes again. But this time he stayed on the road, stopped his truck, and then drove up the road opposite to where he usually went. What made it even worse was that it may have been dark on that road, but we were equipped with flashlights and had a few fires going on, so we could see the roadway in front of us and the parking lot, just not so much of the stretch of the road that he had gone down. With that being said, we could see this guy staring directly at us while driving by with a bunch of crap in the back of his truck. Again, no girlfriend. Sam stayed on the question of where the hell the girlfriend went, as we hadn't seen her all day since the day before. Apparently, the husband of Sam's mom's friend had a gun somewhere, so we felt a bit safer with him around. Plus, Sam's mom's boyfriend at the time had a few baseball bats to hit some balls with if needed. Even with all the protection we had, and the projection that the guy wasn't actually going to do anything, I still felt super creeped out and teared up a little. The thought that we weren't going to leave that place alive the next day. Sam's mom and her friend came over and told us that they too were getting freaked out and offered to take us home, but we ended up just staying the night. We did move our tent closer to Sam's mom's tent to feel safer. As we were doing that, though, this guy, of course, drives up, drives away again, which indeed made us further worry. I wish I was as chill about it as Sam, but nope. During the night, I kept listening to those noises around us and tried to fall asleep. However, I was scared awake to the point that I had sat straight up with my eyes wide open and heard the noise of two fishermen walking down a path that led to a little fishing spot. However, I swore I heard that truck driving on the road once or twice. After a while of calming myself down, I fell back asleep and woke up at around 6 or 7 when everyone else was already awake. While we ate breakfast and just chilled, the strange guy drove up and away again, and Sam's mom's friend had told us that he had been doing that ever since they first got up, which led us to believe that there was a good chance he had been doing it all night as well. So we packed up all of our stuff after me and Sam explored down a path and found a cool hidden beach spot. While we were driving down the road to leave, the guy was driving his red truck again up the road to our site. As we passed by him, he glared straight at us through his window, so hard that he actually turned his head to us while we were passing by. And there was still no girlfriend. I caught that incident on video, actually. Fortunately, this was the last time we ever saw him, but it still scared the hell out of me. I actually thought we were going to be chopped up that night by that guy. Me and Sam now joke about how we were nearly murdered on that trip from time to time, and we're actually going camping at the same place this upcoming weekend. I really hope that guy isn't there. I mean, what are the odds of him being there again? The sound of those tires slowly driving up the road and his glare gives me the chills every time I think about it. I'm 23 years old and I serve in the U.S. Army. I'm a strong Christian and I have spent the good majority of my life fascinated with the supernatural, as to include angels and demons. When I was younger, around 12 or 14, I wasn't so much a devout Christian. I dabbled in witchcraft, minor spells and rituals, but nothing too serious. It's a black mark on my life I wish I could take back, but it's something nonetheless. And that isn't where it begins. My entire life, I have seen, felt, and heard things others couldn't. I've heard a lot about certain people being spiritually sensitive. I suppose I could be one of those people. I'm not 100% positive I am, but I know I have seen more than any of my close friends or any of my colleagues I've shared my stories with. For the record, I don't believe in ghosts. I believe when a person dies, their spirit goes either to heaven or to hell. There is no in-between, and that's just my personal belief. I do believe demons feed off a person's fears and beliefs, so they may take some type of image as someone deceased. But that again is just my personal belief. I'm just setting a ground basis for my tale. I did the majority of my ghost hunting between 17 and 19. I was bullheaded and dead set on finding something. Something dark. Something scary. I'll quote my mother. Sometimes when you look for something hard enough, you may not find it, but it may find you. In my situation, this couldn't have been truer. I went through the various graveyards, abandoned hotspots, and in Florida in my area there was an old school with severe fire damage called Popash. I believe it's torn down now. We went there and saw nothing extraordinary, a few cold spots, nothing severe. We also went to an old abandoned World War II hospital and only went through the top floor. We had a chair appear in a different spot on the way out than was on the way in, and some cold spots, but again, nothing else. My friends and I, we just kept on getting bolder, braver, less afraid. We got to the point we falsely believed we could storm the very gates of hell and proceed unscathed. My friends, I was very wrong. I have always believed as a Christian, a demon could never physically cause you any pain, could not touch you or harm you, and perhaps they can't. Perhaps I was a special case since I was abusing the thought of, I suppose you would call it, Christian invincibility, against the supernatural at least. Well, one fateful night in the summer of 2005, I was proven wrong. It was a simple night. Pizza, a few friends over just talking about our spooky stories, nothing severe, no Ouija boards or seances, just sitting and talking. What happened next, no one, especially I, could have possibly expected. It began slowly. I felt it tingling through my arms, and then it became hard for me to breathe. I began struggling to inform my friends that something was wrong. My body began to lock up, and by this time they were well aware of something going wrong. What happened next, I'm not going to go into full detail because in all honesty, it's something I don't like thinking about or talking about. But needless to say, I was put through about 2.5 hours of excruciating pain and fear. I've been to Iraq. I've been shot at. I've had IEDs go off on my convoy, and nothing to this day has scared me or hurt me as much as what happened that night. I know my description may seem vague, but believe me, the things I saw in my head and the pain I felt, it's hard to describe. Apparently, my friend's account of this experience included them calling my youth pastor at 2 a.m. to come help, holding my hands to keep me from gouging out my eyes, and they were praying like their lives, or more correctly, my life, depended on it. The weeks following, I felt unsafe, very afraid every day I went back into my room. Crosses I had always hung up on my walls always seemed to be either upside down or off the wall completely. I was plagued by nightmares of the things I saw. It was a very dark time, and I continued to pray for deliverance, and in time everything stopped. Was this a punishment for the things I'd done and the occult I dabbled in? Probably. But believe me, friends, the hell I experienced in that time was awful, and let my story be a warning. Do not mess with anything if you cannot handle the consequences that may come to follow. Take my story as whatever you like. Blow me off like I'm a nut, as I'm sure many of you will. But for any of you that have begun down the road I once walked, trying to live both in the light and the dark, reconsider your choices. Scary School, submitted by Dopey Dick. When I was in high school, I was on the rifle team, and we practiced at our range in the basement of our school. I think the school was built in the 50s or something like that, but by the 2000s it seemed really old, but not as old as some of the other school buildings in my town. Having said that, a basement is a basement is a basement. The team wasn't super popular, and there were only about 6 of us on it. And looking back, it seems like there were only about 6 to 10 people on the teams we competed against. I guess rifle just wasn't popular in my neck of the woods. But we didn't care, and we had a blast, no pun intended. One day, we were wrapping up practice, and me and my 2 friends, I'll call them Tom and Pete for this, as to not embarrass them if they hear it, were hanging around still wanting to practice. The other guys had taken off for the late bus, and my coach was preparing to leave too. I asked him if we could stay and practice a little longer. I reminded him how safe we were, and gave him all the excuses a kid comes up with when they want to do something outside the box. At first he said, "Guys, we're done for the day, we've got more practice tomorrow, go on home." but Tom and Pete jumped in, and he stood there looking at us for a few minutes while we pled our case. And then he did what I know now as an adult was a terribly negligent thing to do. He let us stay to shoot for another hour, but told us we really had to clear out of there by 6:15. Now, before I go any further, I want to just say that most of the stories of a ghostly nature that I've heard always seem to happen at night. As I just said what time it was certainly not the case with what we were about to experience. Excited to shoot some more, we got our gear ready while our coach left and decided to have our own 3-man competition. After the first round, Tom looked at me and said, "Hey, Rich, did you see that over there?" And he pointed his finger towards the far end of the basement. I said, "No, what are you talking about?" And he said, "I swear to God, I saw a guy standing over there just a second ago." He then went on to say that it wasn't one of those out of the corner of his eye things. He was looking straight over there and saw a guy. When he turned his back to us to ask us if we had seen anything, the guy had disappeared. Pete and I told him he was crazy. There was nobody else down there. And even if there was, it was probably just a custodian wondering why there was shooting going on past 5:15. But in the back of my mind, I also thought, if it was someone from the school, they certainly would have come over to ask us why we were still there. We didn't make a big deal out of it, but it was kind of spooky. We got ready for our next round and got to it. When we finished, I think all 3 of us on instinct looked over to the far corner, and we couldn't believe our eyes. There was a guy standing there looking at us, wearing what I can only call a madman suit. It was a boxy suit with one of those skinny ties, and I think what stood out to us was it was brown. In the 2000s, not many of the adults or teachers in our lives wore brown suits. And he was also wearing horn-rimmed glasses, which was not a fad at the time. As we all turned to look at each other and say, "Holy shit," we looked back, and the guy was gone. "I think we should all get the heck out of here," said Tom. I said nothing, and Pete said, "Screw that. Let's shoot one last round and see if he comes back. Then we'll go over and see if we can talk to him." I don't think I need to point out that Pete was into all that ghost hunter stuff on TV. So we all kind of agreed, knowing that we were safe as the stairs were to the other side of the basement, and if need be, we could be out of there if we hauled ass. So, we got back into position for one more round, and I have to admit I was shooting poorly because I was intrigued with that back corner of the basement and kept glancing over there. It was screwing up my breathing. It was screwing up my concentration, but I reminded myself it was just practice and who cared anyway. We finished up, and all of us immediately looked over to the corner, and there was the guy. All of us, rifles still in hand, immediately started walking quickly over to the man who did not disappear this time, and stood there just staring at us with a mean look on his face. The closer we got, the more we noticed how angry he really looked. When we got closer to him, Pete yelled out, "Hey, do you like how we shoot?" I looked at Tom like, what the hell is he doing? As God is my witness, the man, still glaring at us, raised his hand, pointed at us and said, "Practice is over. You don't belong here. Go home." We all stopped dead in our tracks and watched him turn around and walk through a closet door. I said, "F this, let's go," but Pete ran to the closet and ripped it open. There was nothing in there but cleaning supplies, a mop bucket, and some brooms. The guy was nowhere to be seen. We had no idea what to do, and decided to actually haul ass out of there. We didn't tell anyone and talked about it all the way home in Tom's car. He dropped me off after he dropped off Pete and said, "Are we crazy? I mean, we saw and heard that guy tell us to get out of there. There's no way that didn't happen." I agreed and said, "Yeah, that happened." And I said, I think we got to make sure not to tell anybody, but we probably should talk to Coach about this." The next day at practice, we were too excited to wait until it was over to bring it up with the coach. He looked at us, then pulled us aside while the other guys kept going with practice. "What did he look like?" he asked. And we realized he was dead serious, and he wasn't telling us immediately that we were chasing phantoms or that we hadn't seen anything that really wasn't there. Pete gave a pretty good description, and Tom and I agreed, and he kind of shook his head with a little smile. He then told the other guys to keep at it, and told us to store our rifles and to follow him. We did, and he took us to our main hallway of the school where there was all the awards and pictures of alumni and that sort of stuff. One of the pictures up there was of the first principal of the building. I'll say that his name was Mr. Smith, and holy cow, that was the guy when we saw his picture. Coach said that he ruled the building with an iron fist, and while he was a good educator, every kid was terrified of him, or at least terrified to get into trouble. He said all the kids even called him Old Ironsides, and that we were not the first people to say that they had seen him somewhere in the school after hours. We couldn't believe it. Had the guy known we weren't supposed to be there and showed up from the afterlife to tell us to knock it off, still thinking that he was in charge of the school? I have no idea, but we know what we saw. Coach agreed that we probably did see him, and we never practiced after 5:15 again. What My Daughter Saw, submitted by O. Henry 12. My family always went camping as a rule. I grew up that way and continued the tradition with my own family. We would go to a lot of different places with our gear and enjoy nature for what it was instead of doing things like Disneyland and stuff like that. When my daughter was born in 1996, my wife and I took her for her first camping trip. She was great on it, and we decided that because she was that good, we knew she could handle it, and we were going to make camping a family thing going forward. And we did. We went on a ton of trips and had a lot of fun. When my daughter was 10, we took a camping trip to a state park in the state I'm from. It was just like a lot of other places that we had been, and it was just for the weekend, so it wasn't anything super fancy. It was just a quick getaway from home and work. When we got there weren't many others tent camping in our area that we stayed at. We did see other people in the cabin area, of course, and there were other people out there, but no one was within 4 or 5 campsites from us on either side. After setting up camp, we were all sitting at a picnic table trying to decide what to do with the day. Go to the little lake that was in the park, go on a hike, or whatever. While we were chatting away, a camp mug that I had set down on the picnic table suddenly slid across it and fell off of it on the far end. All of us looked at it and thought, geez, that's weird. I mean, there was no wind, and we were all sitting pretty calmly and not rocking the table back and forth. There was really no explanation as to why that mug slid all the way across the table. I tried to make a joke out of it and said, oh, this campsite must be haunted, and it made my daughter and wife laugh. I just picked up the mug, put it back on the table, and we forgot about it. We opted for a hike, and that's what we did. We were gone for about 2 or 3 hours, and when we returned to camp, it was time to eat, so I set up my camp stove and also started getting a fire going. I was going to roast corn and potatoes in the fire and fry up some fish that we had purchased fresh that morning. As I was getting the fire going, I looked at my camp stove, and it was one of those green Coleman white gas ones. You know, the kind that folds up on the side and has 3 burners? Well, as I was looking at it, it collapsed, the lid slammed down, and again, there was no wind. I couldn't figure out how it happened, but I figured maybe I just hadn't set it up properly. So I walked over to the picnic table where it was set up, put the sides in their slots again, and then went back to the fire. Before I even got to it, I heard the lid on the stove slam down again. Of course, when I turned around, it's exactly what I saw. The stove had collapsed again. I didn't know what to think, but for whatever reason, I just got the fire going and then went back to the stove, set it up again, and continued on with my meal prep. I didn't mention this to my wife, and certainly didn't mention it to my daughter. I just got our food taken care of without any further incident, and then we sat around the campfire that evening without anything else happening. When we woke up in the morning, I was going to the communal bathroom to get cleaned up while my wife and daughter got their breakfast stuff together. She had just taken my daughter to the showers and was coming back when I was leaving. We were going to have cereal, a huge hit with my daughter. You know those little boxes of cereal that you can turn into a bowl? The big variety pack. I love those things myself. My daughter chose a box and set it on the picnic table while my wife went to our cooler to get milk. Suddenly, the box basically exploded, throwing cereal all over the place. My daughter screamed and fell back off the picnic bench she was on. She was so scared. Now, there was no sound, just the box popping open and shooting the cereal all over. I came running back when I heard my daughter scream. My wife said she didn't know what happened. She hadn't seen anything. Her back had been turned while she was getting the milk, and when she turned around, all she saw was the cereal all over the table. I'm a pretty skeptical guy, but this was getting really odd. Too many goofy things were happening for my liking. So I calmly got another box of cereal for my daughter, told my wife it was no big deal, and something must have happened with the packaging of the cereal that made it do that. I don't know. I was grasping at straws at this point. We ate a quick breakfast and decided to go down to the lake for the morning, and we did. But we didn't talk about what had happened. We just wanted to enjoy the summer day at this little beach on the lake. We went back to our campsite and just got in a truck to go to a lunch place a few miles outside of the park. After we ate, we wandered around this little town that was really cute, looking in the shops and such. But all the while, I kept thinking about the weird stuff that was happening at our campsite. How in the hell could all of that stuff actually be happening? I mean, we weren't imagining it. It was really happening. Eventually, we went back to the campsite for dinner, and as I was getting it ready, my wife took my daughter to the shower house to get cleaned up. I wasn't talking about it to either of them, and I was really preoccupying all my thoughts, though. It was just so strange. I mean, what was happening? Or rather, what had happened earlier? So, nothing happened during dinner, and I built another fire for us to enjoy. We were going to be heading home in the morning, and we just wanted to have one more fun night. So while we sat around the campfire, it got dark, and I was just telling funny family stories, and my daughter was talking about going into the 5th grade. She was really excited to go back to school to see her friends. Suddenly, she stopped and stared over my shoulder into the forest behind me. "What's up, sweetie?" I asked her. Her eyes got big, and suddenly she just screamed her head off. I mean, it literally made me jump out of my lawn chair. My wife screeched a little too, she was taken aback so much. She held my daughter's hand while I whirled around to see what the heck she had just seen. There was nothing there, but my daughter was still crying, and I had to ask her again, "Sweetheart, what did you just see?" Through her tears and blubbering, she said, "A man, Dad, a bloody man." Again, I looked over at the forest, walked to the edge of it, and even went into the trees for a little bit, but there was no one there. I went back to the campfire and said, "Sweetie, there's no one there. Are you sure that's what you saw?" She nodded her head and said, "Dad, there was a bloody man standing there just watching us." Well, that was it. My wife decided that we were leaving right then and there, and I agreed as I didn't want my daughter to spend the night terrified out there. I started to pack everything up, took the tent down, and my wife and daughter just sat by the fire. Then my wife got up to help me get everything into my truck. Once we were loaded, we got in for the drive home. As I was backing out of our campsite onto the little road that would lead us out of the park, my headlights illuminated the forest behind our site, and my blood ran cold. There was a bloody man standing at the edge of the forest, but he wasn't really all there, if you know what I mean. He was kind of transparent, the typical ghost kind of thing that you hear about. I couldn't believe it was happening. I blinked, looked back up, but the man was gone. I'm telling you, I know he was there, and I saw him as plain as day. I didn't say anything about it to my wife or daughter. We drove home and got in bed, everyone a little shaken up still, and we were talking about what had happened at the campsite. Finally, I put a stop to it, saying that we were all very tired, and all we were doing was getting ourselves worked up even more. My wife agreed, and my daughter didn't really want to talk about it anymore either. The next day, I called the ranger's office at the park to let them know what was going on at that campsite, at the risk of them thinking I was crazy. The ranger was an older guy who listened to me, and when I actually told him, "Look, man, don't think I'm crazy," he paused for a moment and then said, "You're not. And you're not the first person to tell us of something strange happening at that loop of campsites." He then went on to tell me that 20 years before, a guy who was camping there by himself was attacked and mauled by a bear. He laid there by himself, sustaining a lot of injuries before someone found him and took him to the hospital. But sadly, even though he did get to the hospital, he lost his life. I can't imagine what it's like to be mauled by a bear, and I don't want to think about it. The ranger didn't say that what I saw and the guy were connected. He just made mention that a guy had been killed out there. I didn't tell my wife or daughter about that right away, and I kept it to myself. When my daughter was 18 or so, I did let them know what the ranger had told me, and they were both shocked. I am convinced that the spirit of that poor bastard is still out there in that park at those campsites. I only wish we hadn't seen him. Lost. Submitted by B. Bopalula. This story doesn't have any ghosts or monsters or Bigfoot or whatever, but it's the scariest thing that ever happened to me. When I was in my 20s, I was engaged to be married, and a couple of months before the wedding, my fiancée decided she didn't want to get married anymore, basically gave me back the ring, and then took off to Florida. We lived in Colorado at the time, and she just up and took off. It blew me away, and blew everyone away. Her parents were pissed, my family was dumbstruck, and all of her friends were completely WTF. Anyway, you can imagine I was kind of in the dumps. I needed to get away from everything, and my job was really cool when they found out what happened. They allowed me to take time off and not charge me for vacation. I mean, they knew how upset I was. I thought that was really cool. I still talk to a lot of those people and my old boss to this day. After lounging around the house for a day or two feeling terrible and sorry for myself, I decided to go on a hiking trip and do a little camping, and I figured I could go out and just clear my head and do some thinking about where my life was headed. So I gathered up my gear. I had to buy some other stuff, loaded up my pack, and off I went. I told my parents and my brother where I was headed, and they just said to be safe. At first, my mom tried to talk me out of going by myself, but she saw that I really needed to be alone and figure things out. I arrived at a trailhead midday, and it was a couple-hour drive for me to get where I wanted to go, so, leaving my car behind, I began to make my trek. I brought enough provisions for about 3 days and figured I would connect some of the trails to extend the hike. The first day was awesome, and I saw a couple of people also hiking, but I learned from them that the trail I was on had pretty light usage and I wouldn't really be seeing a lot of people. In a way that made me feel good because I didn't want to be around people, but at the same time, it also made me a little nervous that I wouldn't be seeing a lot of folks, and without being too negative and thinking something bad would happen, I was conscious of the fact that if something did go wrong, I'd be in trouble. Truth be told, trouble is what I eventually found myself in. I stopped to camp as the sun was going down and figured I would just set up my little Whisperlight stove and make some noodles. I was just going to bivvy out there and not sleep in a tent, although I did bring one. After I ate, I cleaned up and sat back with a bottle of Maker's Mark and just sat thinking about everything that was happening to me. After a bit, I went to sleep, and the next day brought more of the same. Great hiking, awesome views, some interesting people who wanted to stop and chat, but they were few and far between. I camped again as the sun was going down, trying to relax and think about where I was headed, and I know it was early on in this whole thing with my ex-fiancée taking off, but I was starting to look at her a little differently and put things into perspective. I was working hard about not being angry with her and trying to just focus on myself. I realized that wasting time on a person like that is just that, wasted time. The next morning, I noticed the skies getting dark and was thinking I should start heading back and maybe take some trails towards my car, so the next day I'd be able to complete the hike and get into my car and go home. Unfortunately, the rain came, and this was not just rain, this was a hell of a thunderstorm. I don't know if you've ever been out in that area, but you can see the storms coming, and you can see the lightning and you can hear the thunder, and it's really beautiful to be honest, but also kind of scary, especially when you know you're out in the middle of nowhere without shelter. I found a little outcropping of rocks and held up there as the really heavy stuff came down. I just sat there listening to the thunder boom all around me. Man, it was so loud. After a while, the rain stopped and I started my hike again, and looking at an old map, I thought I would take a shortcut that would get me back to my car a little faster. I would have one more night to stay out there, but I figured this would save me some time. I mean, I was having a blast, but I was also at that point where I was ready to go home. So, off I went down this trail. I realized, after about an hour, that something was not right about it. It didn't really feel like a trail anymore. It was kind of like bushwhacking, but not really serious bushwhacking. It just didn't feel like a trail. I guess that's the only way I can describe it. Up to this point, everything I was walking on had been clearly defined, and you could tell that people used it all the time. I was now on something that looked like no one had been out there for years. So I stopped and looked at this crappy map that I had brought and thought if I made a beeline straight away from this trail, I would find another trail that would get me back to where I needed to be. I started to make my way across between these two trails that the map said were there and realized pretty fast that this was probably a really stupid idea. I had my compass out, but the way I was walking, I was kind of zigzagging all over the place and not being able to keep a straight direction. Part of that was due to the terrain. It just wasn't a straight shot like I thought it was going to be. So I'm out there thinking that I'm heading in the right direction, not realizing that I'm not, but my compass says I am. Night's starting to fall, and I realize I'm going to have to stay out here even though there's no ideal places to stop. After finding a somewhat decent place, I stopped, ate something, and realized that in the morning I was going to have to figure something out because this map was useless now. It was kind of useless to begin with. I was pissed off at myself for making a stupid decision like this instead of staying on the trail. If there's any moral of the story in this, it's stay on the trail. In the morning, I woke up and looked at that dumb map again for whatever reason. I got my bearings, checked my compass, and started heading in a direction that I knew there had to be a trail. I walked and walked and walked all day long and did not come across any trail. I couldn't figure out how this was humanly possible. It didn't make any sense. There had to be something out there, no matter what direction I went in, but I wasn't coming across anything or anyone. I started to realize I was on the edge of being really screwed. I remember sitting down to try to think things through and keep calm. That's another moral of the story. Keep calm. I did, but at this point I knew I was lost and I didn't know how I was going to get out of here. It kind of felt like I was in the Blair Witch Project, where the people are walking around and around and they're just going in circles. That wasn't the exact case with me, it just felt like that. Night was coming again, and I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to stay out here again until I can figure out where the hell I'm going. So I stopped and noticed that I was going to be running out of food real soon. I did bring extra, knowing that something always could go wrong, but I didn't think I was going to have anything go wrong. Now, here I was. I slept as best as I could and woke up with the sun and started off in an easterly direction. There had to be a trail out there. But as I had no idea where I was kind of scared. I stayed positive and made my way, but it's hard to shake that feeling when you're not seeing any progress and you feel like you're really lost. I walked and walked again, and still nothing. I came up on a little hill and saw a lake in the distance and figured I would make my way towards the lake, as for whatever reason in my head, I thought that a trail had to go to the lake. Yeah, that's the way I was thinking, not super rational. I made for the lake, and just like anything else and anyone who's been out in the woods or out hiking, everything looks a hell of a lot closer than it really is. I figured I'd be there in an hour or so, but after 2 hours of walking, I still had not found my way to the lake following my compass direction. Night was falling again, and now I knew I was really in trouble. That night I barely slept at all. I'm a grown man, and I'm not going to lie. I was scared to the point of tears. I was frustrated and mad at myself for being an idiot and going off the trail. I finally dozed off and woke up angry. I was not going to sit around feeling sorry for myself. I was going to make this happen and get the hell out of there. Thankfully, after a half day of walking, I did come across a trail. I had no idea where it led, but I was just happy to be on something that was defined. I started walking, hoping to run into someone who could tell me where the hell I was. And thank God that actually happened. A young couple was coming up the trail and saw me and waved. I stopped them and asked what trail I was on, and they told me, then asked if I was okay. They could tell something was wrong. I told them that I had gotten lost and was now trying to figure out how to get back to where my vehicle was. They were really cool, gave me some food that they had, and told me that they had a different map than mine. We looked at it, and I was nowhere near my car. How the hell I got that far away from it, I have no idea. They asked if I would walk with them for a bit in the direction of my car, and I said yes. I needed company at that point. I was over being by myself. We walked along until they were taking a different trail, but now I had an idea of where I was, so that made things a little easier. It did take longer to get to my vehicle, and as a matter of fact, an extra whole day, but I made it to my car, thankful that I did. I didn't realize that my family was at home wondering where the hell I was. All I knew was I was hungry, I was thirsty, and I was miserable. But as I got into my car, I realized something. In the face of adversity, I got out of being lost. I stayed strong and found my way, and I think that was some kind of message or metaphor for where I was in life. Things for me personally were upside down, but I knew at that moment I would get through it, because that's just the way life is. If you work at it, you'll get through it. I left part of me out in that national forest, but I also found a new part of me, one that I had never realized was in me. I'm sure some of your listeners will think this is a cheesy story with a goofy happy ending, but the truth be told, I have never been more scared in my entire life. If you've ever really been lost and you're fighting the feelings that you have when you're out in the middle of nowhere all alone, let me tell you, it's scarier than any horror movie. When your mind wanders and you're thinking, shit, this is it, I'm dead, it's not a fun time. I'll end here. I eventually found another wonderful woman, and we've been happily married for years and have 2 kids. I take them hiking and we all go camping, and I always remind them to stay on the trail and to never lose your cool if you do get lost. Haunted Object, submitted by Hazeltine. Most of my life, I was an extremely skeptical person. I'm not talking the skepticism people on those ghost shows claim that they have when you know full well they've bought into the paranormal hook, line, and sinker. I was raised in the Catholic Church, but never believed a word of it, and even though I went through the motions because my parents wanted me to, even then I was strictly an atheist. I had lots of friends who had what they claimed to be paranormal experiences in their house or wherever, and I did not discount their experiences. I wasn't there, but I was also the first to tell them not to jump to conclusions and to think things out rationally and look for a rational explanation before going to the paranormal as an answer. So, the story I'm about to share with you needs that context for everyone to understand my state of mind and what happened to me. I want to stress that, again, I'm not saying it was ghosts or something from the beyond, but the truth is, what happened to us we could not explain through conventional methods. Having said that, I'm also fully aware that conducting a full scientific investigation using the scientific method is practically impossible in a house. It's not a laboratory, it's not a vacuum, things don't work perfectly. But we did honestly talk a lot about it and did try to find a rational explanation. We moved into our home, which was a new build in 2012. There had only been one previous owner, a young couple who had moved out of state, so when we got the house in 2014, it was really barely lived in. It was a great neighborhood, lots of kids for our kids to play with. My husband John and I have 2 boys and a girl, all under the age of 15, and we all loved living there. Well, I don't know why I said that in the past tense, because we still do live here. 6 months into living in the house, John's mother tragically passed away from stage 4 cancer. It was a rough go, and we were very involved in helping her to be comfortable in her last days. One of the things she wanted John to have when she was gone was a music box that she had used to play to calm him down when he was a child, and that she had had as a child herself. John was an only child, and as silly as it may sound for a man to have a music box, it was an unbelievably sweet gesture on her part, and something that we still cherish and love. However, when we brought the box into our home, that's when strange things started to happen, and they only happened in the rooms or areas where we kept the music box. When we first got it, we put it in our family room on a table. It was a tough reminder for all of us, but it was also comforting to have a piece of my mother-in-law with us at all times. One day, I was not at work, home caring for my youngest who was not feeling well, when I went into the family room and heard music. I will never forget, it was Hey Bulldog by the Beatles. I didn't have a radio on. Our television is hooked up for music channels, but that was not on. And I thought perhaps our neighbors had been playing something outside. So I was standing there in my living room listening clearly to this song and not knowing where it was coming from. I immediately went outside to see if there was a neighbor out there, but no one was. When I went back into the living room, a bulldog could still be heard, loud and clear. The music box lid had been open, and for whatever reason I walked over to it, closed the lid, and immediately the music stopped. I was beyond myself. I opened the lid again, but nothing happened. So I left it open and went about my day taking care of the house and my child. When John got home, I mentioned it to him, and he didn't know what to say. We both knew that my mother-in-law was a huge Beatles fan, but that didn't give us any answers as to why a music box would be connected to a song floating in the air. We chalked it up to something in the airwaves, or perhaps my cell phone was picking up some kind of signal, and we just left it at that. It wasn't until the next morning that we started to get a little more concerned about things. When I got up early to get breakfast ready for everyone and get ready for work myself, I went into the kitchen and looked into our family room. All of our furniture, and I'm talking 2 chairs, a couch, a love seat, plus all of our entertainment center stuff, had been pushed into the middle of the room. For whatever reason, I thought it looked like someone was getting ready to paint. They were trying to cover up all the furniture by just pushing it into the center of the room so everything would be away from the walls. I immediately ran back upstairs and got John, who was just about to get in the shower. I told him he needed to come downstairs right now, so he did. He took one look at the family room and asked how the heck I had been able to do that in the night, and why did I do it? I looked at him without dropping a note and said, "You honestly think I did this?" He said, "Well, who else could have? I certainly didn't." We were not fighting, but our conversation obviously was confused on both sides, and now 2 of our oldest had come downstairs for their breakfast and immediately asked why all the furniture was in the middle of the room. John just laughed and said he was working on something last night and thought maybe we could paint the living room, but he wasn't so sure now. It was a stupid explanation for our kids, just so that they wouldn't think something strange was happening or something was wrong. John gave me a quick hug and said he would take care of it when he got home from work and not to worry about it. We all went about our day, and he did take care of it when he got home. I thought about the music box and wondered if there was a connection to the strange music and this stuff happening in our family room, but again, I just brushed it off and said there's got to be an explanation for this. I thought maybe there was vibrations or something like that, or maybe John had done something in the middle of the night and didn't remember it. He had been a sleepwalker as a kid, and I thought, hey, maybe it came back and he didn't even realize it. That night was a Friday, and Fridays in our family are family nights. We make it a point to spend time as a family, have pizza, and watch a movie and play games. We were all in the family room getting ready to play Uno when the stack of cards that had been sitting on our coffee table that we were getting ready to sit next to spilled out of the box onto the carpet and went all over the floor. I looked at John and didn't say anything. The kid saw it and started asking questions about how we had done that trick. I just told him that it was a funny trick and we wanted to continue on with the evening, not to worry about it. We did, and nothing else happened. That night, without asking John, I took the music box out of the family room and put it into our office/sewing room. When he saw that I'd done that, he asked why I was doing it, and I told him I just wanted to see something. He asked me again what I was doing, and I told him that I wanted to see if anything would happen in our office if the music box was in there. He gave me a look and he said, "Look, there has to be a rational explanation for this. There always is, and I'm surprised you of all people would think that this music box has something to do with anything else in this house." But I said, "Look, I'm doing it anyway," and he didn't say anything else about it. Nothing happened for 2 days, but on Monday morning, as we were all getting ready for our day, I went into the office to get something I needed to take to the bank. The room was a mess of my yarn, and there were papers strewn all over the place. I called John and pointed at it and said, "You know I was not in there all weekend, and I know that you were not in there all weekend, and none of it was like this when we were in here on Friday night. I don't have an explanation for this, do you?" He shook his head and said, "Yeah, this is a little odd." For a moment we entertained the idea that it was one of our kids, or perhaps all of our kids, but they had been with us almost every moment for the last 2 days, and certainly we would have noticed if they had gone in there and started throwing things around. I mean, the noise alone would have tipped us off. Later that day, I cleaned things up in there and took the music box out. Again, without telling John, I put it in a cardboard box and took it down into our basement to store it on a shelf. The next morning, when I went downstairs to get ready for the day, the music box was sitting back in the family room where we had originally placed it. I immediately asked John about it, and he vehemently denied ever touching the box. He wasn't even aware I had put it in the basement. Again, I was beyond myself, and I didn't know what to do. That evening, John took the kids out for ice cream, and I went over to the music box and said aloud, "Look, you're welcome to stay here. If this is Mom, we know that you love us and we love you very much. But we don't want you scaring the kids, and we don't want you messing up the house." I felt really stupid being a skeptical person talking to an inanimate object, but for some reason I felt it had to be done. The music box lid closed on its own, and since then, nothing has happened in our house that we can't explain. I know a lot of people will hear this and think it's bullshit, but it's true, and as much as I don't want to admit that perhaps an object could be haunted or have some kind of pull to the beyond, or something that we can't explain, I can only point to that thing as being the catalyst for the very weird happenings that happened in my home. Psycho Camping Family, submitted by Paulie D's Nuts. A while back, I decided to take my family camping. Not the stuff I did when I was younger, way out in the middle of the woods with minimal equipment, but, the family campground thing. My son and daughter had never tent camped before, and I really wanted them to get into it so they could do the things that I did when I was younger, when they got older. I still live in the area that I grew up in, and chose a campground that my parents took me to when I was a kid. Super nice place with lots of things to do, and lots of campsites. I checked all my gear and actually put my tent up in my backyard to make sure that everything was still in good shape, and it was. Everyone was excited to go, so I made reservations a couple of weeks in advance before to make sure that we were on a loop that didn't have tons of people, but still had some. I hate overcrowded campgrounds, but I was also hoping to have a couple of other families in a loop, so maybe my son and daughter would find some kids to play with, and my wife and I could just relax and wouldn't have to entertain them all day long. So, I loaded up the Suburban the night before we were going to leave, told everybody we were going to be leaving midday, and to make sure that they had everything else they wanted to bring. And in that case, my kids, that meant their handheld devices. My son had just gotten a PSP, and he was all about that. His younger sister had a Leapster or Frogster or something like that my wife bought her. Anyway, I should mention that my son was 10 years old at the time and my daughter was 8. So, with extra batteries and a vehicle full of gear and food, we set off for the hour drive to the campground. Everyone was in high spirits. The weather was awesome, and we were looking forward to some hiking, swimming, canoeing, and just hanging out in the forest and enjoying everything about this really cool place. We checked in with the forest ranger and drove to our loop and backed in. I immediately got my son to help me pitch the tent, while my wife and daughter unloaded the rest of the stuff. I was very happy with our site selection, as there was a picnic table, and we had a pop-up shelter to go over that to keep out the bugs. And there were a few other families, too, some with kids my son's age, some older. There were about 12 sites on our loop with a bathhouse and a little commissary about a quarter of a mile away in case we ran out of one thing or another. We were planning on staying the week, and I knew we would have to refill our provisions at a bigger store outside of the campground. But I'll tell you what, that place was a meeting place for a lot of the kids, and it did save my butt a few times with things that I forgot to pack. The first night was awesome. We had a campfire and everything was really great. We were enjoying hot dogs over the fire and s'mores afterwards. My kids were just having a blast hanging around our campsite and exploring the little creek that ran behind it. On the second day, my son saw some kids playing kickball, and they were his age, so he asked if he could go over and see if he could play. I said, of course, and just be careful. My wife and I are always conscious of where our kids are, and what they're up to, and who they're hanging out with, but we're not helicopter parents, and we do allow our kids to have a little bit of freedom. My daughter at that time, not so much. But if my son wanted to go where I could actually watch what he was doing, and I was all for it. The more friends you can have, especially in a place like that, the better off your time is going to be. So, off he runs to make some new friends, which I was super happy with. That afternoon, I was happy to just sit in a chair reading a book, having a beer and looking up every once in a while to make sure my son was okay and having fun. He came back in the afternoon for a snack and told me about the cool kids that he had just met. I told him that I was really happy for him. It's not that he had a hard time making friends, but like I said, when you're on vacation, I do remember it being a little difficult to just introduce yourself to a bunch of strangers. That evening, we were going to go on a short hike before it got too dark, and then go back for another campfire. My son was a little bummed that he couldn't go hang out with his friends, but I told him that tomorrow was another day and everything would be just as fun as today. However, that's when the weirdness started. What did happen is one of his friends came over to our campsite and saw my son playing with his PSP the next morning. He asked if he could play, and my son, being the nice guy, said, "Sure." The boy was really, really nice, and he was the same age as my son. And his mother and father came wandering over a little later, and my wife and I had a great conversation with them. They were about the same age as us, with an only child, and we invited them over for lunch, and they accepted, and we had also made some new friends. That afternoon, all the kids wanted to get together again to play kickball. I didn't care. I thought that was fine. The four parents were going to hang out with my daughter, begging to go play as well, and I said, as long as you listen to your brother, you stay where we can see you, have a good time. They did have a good time and came back, but this time another kid came over, one that we hadn't met yet. Something seemed a little off about him. He wasn't handicapped or anything like that. There was just something off about him. I mean, nice kid, but I just couldn't put my finger on what was making me think that there was something wrong. I would soon find out. He also asked to play my son's PlayStation, but my son was actually playing it at the time and said he was in the middle of a game, and if he finished, he would let him play. After a while, it was obvious that that wasn't going to happen. As time wore on, this kid was just getting fidgety and irritated that my son wouldn't let him play with the PSP. Finally, it was dinner time, and I told my son that he had to put the PSP down and we were going to eat. This kid immediately jumped up and said, "Can I play with it now?" I told him that we were going to eat, but maybe later, and he should probably go and see what his family was doing. He kind of pouted and stamped his feet, but then, without a word, ran off to his campsite. That night we had yet another campfire, and I broke out my guitar, was just playing and singing some songs with my family singing along too. From out of the darkness comes this kid. He stands at the edge of the light from our campfire till I say, "Hey bud, what's going on?" He says, "Can I play with the PSP now?" I told him it was kind of late for that and we had put the PSP away, but maybe tomorrow if my son thought it was okay. Again, he pouted and ran off, and at this point my son told me, "Dad, I don't like that kid very much. He's kind of a bully to some of the other kids, and he's actually kind of a whiner." I started laughing when he called him a whiner and said, "Well, we gotta be nice to everybody, so let's see what happens tomorrow and we'll take it from there, okay?" Not long after that, we put the fire out and went to sleep. The next day, we all went for a swim and then went canoeing in the lake at the campground, and were having a great time. Instead of going back to the campsite, we went into a town about a half hour away for some lunch. I also wanted to get a couple of things from the store to replenish what we had used. We were gone for the better part of the day, and when we got back, it was time for us to eat again. While we were having dinner, this kid comes up for the third time asking to play with the PSP. At this point, I know the story's long, and not really much has happened, but it's actually important for what actually happens next. I tell him again we're eating, and we'll have to talk about it later. I'm getting tired of this. This time the kid says, "I don't fucking believe you. You've been lying to me this whole time. You're all a bunch of assholes." And then he took off. Now, I swear around my kids probably more than I should, but all of us were shocked with the mouth on this kid. I didn't know who his parents were, but if I found out and bumped into them, I was going to say something. I don't like that kind of language in front of my daughter, especially. Darkness started falling, and I was getting up another fire. It's not quite dark yet when some guy comes up and says, "Hey, "Are you the father of the kid with the video game?" I look at him and I say, "I suppose I could be. I don't know if any of the other families have kids with video games." He gets closer, and I can tell he's been drinking or something. He's kind of stumbling a little bit, and he's slurring his words. He says, "Okay, I'll be more specific. Are you the father of the kid with the video game who keeps promising my kid he can play with it?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I have told him that, but we've been busy, and we've been doing other family things, so we really haven't had a time for him to play with it." The guy says, "Well, there's no time like the present. Why don't you give me the game so my kid can play with it?" I can't remember how much I paid for the PSP, but I'm sure it was more than $100 at least. I just say to him, "I'm not really comfortable handing over a video game system like that. If we can work something out tomorrow, let's do that." This guy is now in my face, and he again says, "Well, like I said, there's no time like the present, and I think you should hand over that video game." I'm not going to be Mr. Nice Guy anymore. I tell him, "Step back, out of my face, and it's a good idea if he went back to his campsite." He says, "What are you going to do about it?" And I say, "Look, we're both adults. We're too old for that kind of stuff. I just think you better go back to your site." He just kind of looks at me as if he's thinking about shoving me or taking a swing, but he doesn't say anything other than muttering under his breath, "Asshole." Then he leaves. I'm thinking, okay, that's over. Let's get on with the night. But no, suddenly here comes a woman who we figure out pretty fast is this guy's wife. I say hello, and she walks right past me and goes up to my wife and calls her a bitch and says, "Why won't you let my kid play with the video game?" My wife says, "Number one, don't talk to me like that. And number two, I've just decided your kid is not going to play with the video game ever. Now get out of my campsite." My wife's kind of a badass. I try to keep things cool. This woman also looks like she's trying to slap my wife or something, but then walks away. My wife comes over to me and whispers, "I think they're either drunk or high or something." And I agree. Something was definitely off with the entire family. So I say, what are we going to do? Let's just have another fire tonight. And we did. More s'mores, and I swear to God, my kids probably gained 10 pounds that week just from the sweets. Later that night, we had gone to bed, but sometime after midnight, I can't remember exactly when, I heard something or someone rummaging around our campsite. At first I thought maybe it was raccoons or, oh God, I hope it's not a bear. But it could be, so I grabbed my flashlight, and without trying to wake the kids or my wife, I go to the door of our tent and slowly unzip it so I can look outside and see what's going on. It's not a bear, it's not raccoons. It's the shape of a guy who's going through all of our stuff. I snap my light on and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" It's the guy. He freezes and then kind of stands up with a "what are you going to do about it" look on his face. I get out of the tent, and I'm just in my boxers holding a flashlight, and I say, "I think you really need to go back to your campsite right now, or I'm going to call the forest ranger." He sort of laughs and pulls out a frickin' knife. He says, "I think you better hand over that video game right now." I'm taken aback, and by this point my wife is awake, and I tell her to call the forest ranger right now. She says something about not knowing the number, and I'm short with her, and I say, "It's one of the last ones on my phone, just do it." I walk over to this guy, and I tell him, "Look, buddy, I've been really nice about all this, but I'm telling you right now, if you don't get out of my campsite, I'm going to hand your ass to you." He makes another stupid laugh, and the next thing I know, I'm seeing stars. I did not see his wife standing off to the side, who hit me upside the head with a log. And I fell down, dropping the flashlight, putting my hand up to my head to get my bearings, as this guy starts walking towards me, waving the knife, saying, "Give me the video game." At this point, the fog is starting to clear from my head, and I'm on my knees, so I jump forward, getting him at his knees and dropping him to the ground. I'm now on top of this guy who stinks to high hell, who's got a knife and keeps yelling out, "What the fuck is your problem? What the fuck is your problem?" I can sense that his wife is coming up behind me again, and instinctively I stick my foot out, and she tripped over me, falling right behind us. I get out of this guy's grasp, but I can tell that he is really hammered because he's not putting up too much of a fight. I take a good shot to his jaw and lay him out flat. He's on the ground on his back, making that little snorting noise people make when they get knocked out. I scramble to my feet and see his wife also scrambling to hers, and now she is screaming bloody murder that I killed her husband. I yell at her to calm down. He's not dead, he's just knocked out. She doesn't seem to care and lunges towards me, still holding onto this log. So I kind of sidestep her, put my foot out and trip her, and as she's going by, I grab her by the back of the head and slammed her down on the ground on top of her husband. Now, I don't believe in hitting women, but I was not going to get hit by a log again. Adrenaline is flowing through me, and I'm totally freaking out. I don't fight. I hate fighting, but I knew I had to do something in this circumstance. Now my wife is out of the tent, screaming and crying, and I yell at her, "Did you call the fucking forest ranger?" And then I immediately apologized for swearing and yelling, but by now other people are coming out of their tents and shining lights around and asking what's going on. The guy from the couple that we had met the day before came over, looked down and said, "What the heck happened here?" I gave him a brief synopsis of what had happened, and he shook his head and said, "I'll stick around until help comes." Now here's another freaky part, probably the scariest. Their weirdo kid is running at us with what looks like a samurai sword. He's also yelling at the top of his lungs, swinging this thing around. And the guy that I had just met the day before kind of looked at him as if the kid was running up to him, grabbed the kid's arm, twisted it so he knocked the sword out of his hands and onto the ground. The kid cried out, and the guy told him to sit down and shut up. The kid started crying, but he did what he was told. 5 minutes later, here come the flashing lights. It's not the forest ranger, it's the state police, who apparently take over security of the campground after dark. The guy and his wife are still out of it, and I was happy that it gave me a chance to tell the trooper what had happened. I didn't need their nonsense story interrupting anything. He told me to stand back with my family while he goes and gets the two, and my newfound friend kind of corroborated what I said by saying that the kid, pointing to the kid sitting there, was picking on his kids for the last 3 days while they were playing kickball. The trooper tells us all to stand back again and gets on the radio to speak with someone else. He's helping these two idiots to their feet, and they're groggy but coming to. Another patrol car pulls up, and as I'm standing back with my wife and kids, who are now wide awake standing there next to me, wondering what the heck is going on, they start questioning the two who were coming up with a story that made absolutely no sense. It was totally disjointed, it was all over the place, but the gist of it was about how I went over to their campsite in the middle of the night and invited them over to ours. That was clearly not the case, and the troopers weren't buying it. After more conversations and more people coming out of their campsites to see what was up, the troopers finally take the father away in cuffs, and the woman was screaming. They advised her to take their son back to their campsite for the night, and that they would be back to speak to her tomorrow. They asked me if I wanted to press charges against the woman for hitting me, and I said, no, I don't want anything like that. The guy was getting charged with assault, being drunk in public, and something else I can't remember what it was, disorderly conduct or something. Both of them were also going to be charged with menacing, and it was also later determined that they had some kind of prescription drugs in their tent they were not supposed to have, so that made their day even worse. Everything broke up and we went back to our tents, and I had a hard time going to sleep with the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. The next morning when we woke up, the troopers were already at the campsite up the way, and it looked like they were helping her pack things up. Another car came up and took the little boy away, and then the woman was taken away in cuffs as well. From what a trooper told me later in the week when I stopped him at the commissary, CPS got involved and were taking the child from the couple. I guess this was not the first time they had a run-in with the law. Looking back on everything now, this is not a story that a lot of people will think is scary. But I'll tell you what, when you've got a guy waving a knife at you, his wife hitting you, and then his kid running at you with a sword, yeah, that's a little unnerving. I feel kind of sorry for that kid, and I wonder what happened to him from time to time, and sometimes my son asks me what happened to all three. I don't know what to tell him because I have no idea. It's amazing what people will do over something as stupid as a video game and a kid not getting what he wants. I'm so glad I don't raise my kids that way, and none of his friends are raised that way. Just goes to show you, even at a nice, polite campground, stuff can go sideways. We've been back there a number of times and even tried to schedule the same week with some of the people that we met so our kids can play and we can all hang out and have adult happy hours and that sort of thing. We talk about this incident from time to time and remark that none of us had ever seen anything like that, and probably never will again. What could possibly go wrong, right? So, let's go all the way back to when a friend and I were around 14 years old. This is in the days before the mass adoption of the internet, and so a lot of time was spent outdoors after school playing around with friends. Where I'm from, it would get dark fairly early in the winter, and the house I grew up in had a fairly large plot of land surrounding it, which is where our story takes place. A game that my friend and I really enjoyed around this time was to play hide-and-seek using a torch to help find the person who was hiding, also known as flashlight for anybody in the U.S. My parents had this fairly powerful one that we would sneak out of the house and then use in the game. The person seeking would close their eyes and count to 50 or so, and the person hiding would run off into the night and get to a spot where they wouldn't be easily found. The big rule of the game was that the person seeking had to keep the torch on at all times, and the person hiding was discovered if illuminated by said torch. It made for a fun game of cat and mouse where you could know where your seeker was and use this to your advantage when repositioning. But of course, they could easily spin around quickly and cast a large circle of light over the trees or whatever and catch sight of your white shirt or sneakers. It kept us entertained anyway, and I guess my parents thought it was nice we were doing stuff outside, although it often ended up being fairly creepy and late. This one time, it was my turn to be the person hiding, and I headed down to what I felt might be a good spot, way off towards the far boundary wall of the house. The property was encircled by land, but beyond the low stone walls surrounding it were other houses with their own bits of land. It was very dark away from any house lights, and in this area there was an old abandoned hut that was falling apart. Long grass, a few trees, and a large trench that was deep enough to stand in and disappear below ground level. The obvious place to hide was either under or inside the hut. The door was locked, but it had no windows, though for whatever reason I felt this was way too easy this time around, and I took the chance to get down into the grass just close enough to the ditch that I could slide into it if needed, but keep my head up to watch for the approach of the lamp. Nothing happened for a long time, but I had a feeling that someone was close by. I glanced off to the side and caught sight of my friend, only he wasn't using the torch. That's sneak. He appeared to have his hand over the end of it so that light wasn't coming out, or maybe he'd turned it off and was keeping his hand near to the button in order to snap it on again if needed. Clearly, he'd gotten annoyed that the light was giving him away, and I was avoiding him when he really had just been looking in the wrong place. The land available to us wasn't that vast. Basically, if you were smart, you could use the threat of the moving spot lamp to force the person to move and just listen for the sounds of that, gradually pinpointing where they must be. But no, my friend wasn't doing this. He was trying to do things the easy way and get one up on me. Probably give me a jump to boot. Well, I wasn't going to let him do that. I slid into the ditch. Now I was going to be very hard to find without shining that light down into where I was, particularly with the hut acting as a great distraction. I decided not even to try to get away since I couldn't watch for the light to see which way he was looking. So I just stayed there, very still. Annoyingly, despite my clever hiding spot, my friend got closer and closer and closer to the trench, brushing through the grass in a very deliberate manner and seeming to have a good idea of where I was. I waited for the game to be up, trying not to move. I still didn't see any light. And then, after what felt like forever, my friend walked right by and kept going. I still didn't move. I really, really wanted him to never find me because he was cheating, and it was only when I saw the light way off back towards the house that I climbed out of the ditch and started to loop back the other way. I eventually got caught, and in the debrief after the round, I told my friend just how close he had gotten to finding me in the ditch. He looked slightly concerned. "I didn't go up that way," he said. I laughed as though he was messing with me. "Yeah, you did," I replied. "You were covering the torch trying to catch me out." I don't think we ever ran back inside a house as fast as we did in that moment. I have no idea who it was down at that part of the property in the dark that night, or what they were holding in their hands, and why they seemed to be searching for someone. Me? Despite very much not being invited to play our game. So, creepy guy trying to get in on our wholesome game of hide-and-seek in the dark? Let's not meet.